There had been, in all the long, violent history of the universe, Boros conquered his way across. Exactly one fight worth remembering. He had thought about it in the seconds after his ship's core failed, in the long free fall toward a planet he had never bothered to learn the name of, in the silence before what should have been his death. One fight. One man who had ended a war god in a single motion, without ceremony, without even the courtesy of anger. Boros had spent his final breath laughing. He had not expected to draw another one. There was no ceiling to the place he woke in, and no floor either, only a suggestion of both, an instinct his body trusted more than his eyes did. The sky, if it could be called that, hung the color of a wound just beginning to scab, rust red bleeding into a bruised violet, streaked through with what looked, absurdly, like veins of moving light. The air tasted of sulfur and something colder underneath it, something that reminded him distantly of vacuum. His hearts, both of them, the birth heart and the crystalline replacement grafted into the ruin the war god had left of his chest, were beating in a rhythm that did not match. That alone told him he was not in the place he had died in. He rose. It took longer than it should have. The armor across his shoulders had cracked in 3 places, and beneath it he could feel muscle knitting itself back together in slow, deliberate pulses, the artificial heart doing what it had been built to do, refusing on principle to let him stop being dangerous. He flexed one taloned hand and watched sparks of compressed energy gather unbidden along his knuckles, a reflex older than thought. Good. Whatever had happened to him, it had not happened to that. He remembered the shape of it now, in pieces. The war god, small, absurdly small, a coat and a bald head and eyes that had never once widened at anything Boros had done to him, driving one fist forward through the last technique Boros had ever intended to use, the collapsing star roar, a weapon that did not ask permission of physics. He remembered the moment before impact where the world had simply folded, not exploded, folded, the way a piece of parchment folds when a hand closes around it. And in the crease between one instant and the next, something else had reached through and taken him. He did not know the word for what had happened. He had no reason to. If he had asked, and if there had been anyone nearby capable of a plain answer, he would have learned that a sorcerer 3 realms away, hunting for a weapon sharp enough to finally unseat a titan he despised, had opened a door into a place he did not understand. At a moment, he could not have chosen better if he'd tried, and had pulled through it the single angriest thing his search had ever touched. Boros looked around himself with the particular contempt of a being who has already decided, before evidence, that nothing here will matter. That contempt lasted 4 seconds. Then he saw the sky split apart above a ridge of black volcanic stone in the distance. Not clouds parting, but the world itself tearing at the seams, revealing for a heartbeat a second landscape layered beneath the first. A jungle of violet-black foliage under a wrong sun, before it sealed itself shut again like a wound closing. He felt, more than heard, something vast moving beneath the crust of wherever he stood, patient and old, and paying him no attention whatsoever. And past all of it, at the very edge of a perception that had once been calibrated to detect planet killers from a dozen systems away, he felt something else. Something that did not read as a power level at all. Something that simply was. A presence with no beginning that he could locate, and no end that he could measure, sitting at the bottom of everything like a keel beneath a ship, holding up a structure so vast Boros could not yet perceive its shape. He had felt strong things before. He had eaten planets whole and called it breakfast. He had never, in all his conquering, felt anything that made his hunger this immediate. He did not know its name yet. He would learn it. That was, after all, the entire reason he had never once in his existence turned down a door. 300 miles from where Boros stood testing the give of a landscape he did not trust, fire god Liu Kang sat very still in a chamber built from living amber light, and felt the realms shudder. It was not a large tremor. To anyone without the specific, exhausting burden of holding 6 realms in careful balance after rebuilding them from the wreckage of a broken hourglass, it would have registered as nothing, a held breath, a missed heartbeat in the architecture of existence. But Liu Kang had rebuilt that architecture with his own hands, had chosen every thread of it deliberately, and he knew the particular texture of every kind of disturbance that could touch it. A sorcerer's ritual felt like a held candle guttering. An elder god's attention felt like a held candle guttering. A death that mattered. A hero's death. A villain's death. The kind that reshaped the balance of a realm. Felt like a snapped string. This felt like a door kicked open by something that did not know doors existed. He rose from his seat of judgment without hurry. Hurry was a weakness he had trained out of himself across more timelines than he liked to count, and crossed to the wide basin of still water at the chamber's center, the one he used, in the old ways his predecessor Raiden had once used the storm to see, to look upon the realms he protected. He did not need to ask it a question. The tremor had already told him where to look. Outworld's northern wastes. A stretch of blasted black stone, near the border General Shao's forces patrolled loosely, more out of habit than necessity these days, since Outworld under Shao's iron administration had grown, against every prediction, almost orderly. The water showed him a figure standing amid a crater that had not existed an hour ago, tall enough to dwarf a Shokan, horned, armored in something that was not quite bone, and not quite metal, radiating a heat signature that made the water in the basin ripple, as if it had been struck. Liu Kang watched him for a long moment. The figure did not move like a man lost. He moved like a man taking inventory of a battlefield he had not yet chosen to fight on, which was, in Liu Kang's long experience, considerably more dangerous. "Kung Lao," he said, and did not raise his voice, because he did not need to. The chamber carried his words the way it needed to. "Raiden, come and look at what has entered our realms." They arrived within moments, Kung Lao first, hook swords already at his hip out of pure reflex, and Raiden a half-step behind him, staff in hand, expression already tightening the way it did whenever the balance he'd once sworn his existence to protect showed a crack he hadn't anticipated. Both of them looked into the basin. Neither spoke immediately. "That is not a spell," Raiden said finally. "I would feel a spell. This," he shook his head slowly, "this feels like something was pulled through a door that should not have existed, and the door itself does not know how to close." "Quan Chi," Kung Lao said, with the particular flatness of a man naming a chronic ailment. "This has his signature all over it. Reckless dimensional work, no consideration for what he actually drags back with him. Last time it was half a legion of revenants he couldn't fully control. This time," he gestured at the basin, at the horned figure now crouching to press one hand flat against the black stone as if listening to it. "This, we do not know that it is Quan Chi's doing," Liu Kang said, though his tone did not carry much genuine doubt. "But it does not matter who opened the door. It matters what walked through it." He watched the water a moment longer. The figure straightened, tilted its head back, and Liu Kang saw, even through the imperfect medium of reflected water, something in its bearing that reminded him uncomfortably of the worst of what he had fought to end. Not malice, precisely. Something colder than malice. Appetite. "I will not assume it is an enemy," he said at last, "but I will not assume it is anything else either. Raiden, take a small patrol, special forces, if Sonya can spare a unit on short notice, and enough of our own strength to observe without provoking. I want to know what it is, what it wants, and how strong it truly is, before General Shao's people find it and do something that turns a mystery into a war." He paused. "And Kung Lao, reach out to the Lin Kuei. If this thing moves as fast as it looks capable of moving, we may need eyes that do not need to be told twice to stay hidden." Kung Lao inclined his head, already turning to go. Raiden lingered a moment longer, staff held loosely, eyes still fixed on the basin's rippling surface. "You felt something else in that tremor," he said. It was not a question. Something beneath the arrival itself. Liu Kang did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice had gone quieter, the way it always did when he spoke of things even a fire god preferred not to name carelessly. "I felt something stir that has not stirred since before the elder gods drew their first breath," he said. "I do not think this creature came here by accident, Raiden. I think something in the deepest floor of existence noticed him crossing, and opened its eyes to see why." Boros found the first fighters within the hour, and was, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, almost disappointed by how quickly it happened. They came in a loose vanguard formation across the black stone, 6 of them, armored in the crude, brutal fashion of soldiers who expected to bleed and had made peace with it, carrying weapons forged for a kind of violence Boros recognized instantly. Not ceremonial, not decorative. Working weapons. Outworld's border scouts, dispatched the moment General Shao's watchtowers had registered the crater and the heat bloom at its center, moving with the particular confidence of soldiers who had never once, in living memory, encountered something their general's armies couldn't eventually break. Their leader, a broad-shouldered Tarkatan captain with tusks filed to points and scars mapping a lifetime of border skirmishes, raised a clawed hand, and the formation halted 20 yards out, weapons half raised, eyes doing the fast, professional math of threat assessment. "You will identify yourself," the captain said, in a voice pitched to carry, "or you will be brought before General Shao in chains, whichever this patrol finds less troublesome." Boros looked at him, the way a man looks at a child who has wandered into traffic, not with anger, but with the mild, distant curiosity of someone recalculating how much of his attention this actually deserves. "You are soldiers," he said, and his voice carried easily across the distance, low and resonant, edged faintly with the accent of a language none of them recognized filtered through whatever force had translated it. "That is something, at least. Better than the crawling, mewling things I have found on other worlds. Tell me, is there anything on this world that can actually fight?" The captain's jaw tightened. He had led border patrols against Shokan raiders and chitin swarms and once, memorably, a rogue construct wearing 3 faces at once, and he had never once had a target answer a direct order with a question. "I said identify yourself," he repeated, harder this time, and the soldiers around him tightened their grips. Boros exhaled, something between a sigh and a low laugh, and closed the 20 yards between them in a single stride that displaced enough air to stagger 2 of the outermost soldiers. "You may call me Boros," he said, standing over the captain now, close enough that the soldier had to crane his neck to hold eye contact, close enough that the heat radiating off the crystalline heart visible through the crack in his armor washed over the Tarkatan's face like an open forge. "Dominator, once, of 100 systems, though I suspect that title means very little to you. I am going to ask you a question, soldier, and I would strongly advise you answer it honestly, because I have crossed a very great distance to find someone worth fighting, and I am running low on patience for the ones who are not." The captain, to his considerable credit, did not step back. He raised his blade instead, a serrated Tarkatan warblade, the kind that had opened throats on 3 different battlefields, and set his stance. "We do not answer to invaders," he said. "We test them." Boros's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Good answer," he said, and struck. It was not, by his own private measure, even a fraction of what he could have brought to bear. He had learned, across 100 conquered worlds, the particular etiquette of first contact. You did not open with everything, not against soldiers doing their duty, not against a world you had not yet decided was worth despising. He simply moved, faster than 6 border-hardened veterans could track, and put the flat of one massive hand against the captain's chest, with just enough force behind it to lift the man off his feet and send him skidding 20 feet across black stone, armor cracked, breath driven entirely out of his lungs, alive. The other 5 soldiers, to their considerable credit as well, did not flee. They came at him as a unit, blades and a crude energy lance loosed in a coordinated volley that would have, against a merely strong opponent, been a genuinely dangerous opening. Boros let the lance bolt strike him full in the chest, and felt it dissipate against skin and bone plate that had shrugged off orbital bombardment without complaint. He caught the first blade between 2 fingers, twisted it out of its owner's grip with a motion almost gentle, and used the pommel, not the edge, he noted with something like surprise at his own restraint, to put the man on the ground beside his captain. Within 90 seconds, all 6 of Outworld's finest border scouts lay groaning on black stone, disarmed, bruised, humiliated, and entirely, deliberately, alive. Boros stood over them, and for the first time since waking in this place, something in his chest, the birth heart, not the crystal one, ached faintly with a disappointment so familiar it was almost comfortable. "You fight well," he said, and meant it. There had been genuine discipline in the coordination, a kind of trained ferocity he respected even as he dismantled it, better than most worlds manage on their first attempt. "But you are not what I am looking for." He crouched and picked up the fallen energy lance, turning it over in one clawed hand with something like genuine curiosity before letting it clatter back to the stone. "There is something else on this world, something old and enormous, and it does not fight the way soldiers fight. I felt it the moment I arrived. I am going to find it." He straightened and looked past the fallen scouts toward the horizon, toward the direction where that vast, patient, unmeasurable presence still sat beneath everything like a held breath. "If any of you know its name, I would consider it a mercy if you told me now, and saved us both the trouble of you dying to keep the secret." The captain, propped on one elbow, spat blood onto black stone, and managed, despite everything, something close to a laugh. "You don't know where you've landed, do you?" he said. "There are things in these realms that would eat a boast like that and call it an appetizer." Boros's smile widened, slow and genuine, the first true pleasure he'd felt since the fold of the world had swallowed him. "Then I have landed in exactly the right place," he said. By the time Raiden's patrol reached the crater, Kung Lao at his side, 4 Special Forces operatives fanned out behind them under Sonya Blade's second in command, weapons hot but not yet raised. Boros was gone, and 6 of Shao's finest border scouts sat in a loose, humiliated circle nursing bruises that would take a week to fully heal, arguing among themselves in low, furious voices about which direction the intruder had walked off in. Raiden crouched at the crater's blackened edge, staff braced against the ground, and let a thread of his lightning trail across the scorched stone, tasting the residue of whatever power had touched it. What came back to him was not sorcery. It was not the Netherrealm's corrupted energy, not Outworld's raw brutality, not even the strange cold hum of Edenian magic. It was something entirely foreign, hot, dense, and structured in a way that suggested deliberate control rather than raw chaos. A power that had been shaped and refined across a lifetime of use, the way a blade is shaped by a lifetime of sharpening. He walked away from 6 armed soldiers without killing a single one of them, the Special Forces operative said, crouched beside the nearest groaning scout, checking vitals out of a training reflex older than the mission itself. That's either mercy, or he didn't think they were worth the effort. "Perhaps both," Kung Lao said, arms crossed, watching the horizon in the direction the scouts had finally, grudgingly, agreed on. Liu Kang was right to worry. Something that strong, that controlled, choosing not to kill, that's not weakness. That's a hunter who hasn't found what he's hunting for yet. Raiden rose slowly, lightning still crackling faintly at his fingertips, unspent, and looked out across the black wastes toward a horizon that suddenly felt considerably less stable than it had that morning. "Then we had better find him before Shao's next patrol does," he said, "because the next patrol will not stop at soldiers he considers not worth killing, and I do not think this creature intends to stop walking until something in these realms finally gives him a reason to." Behind them, one of the fallen border scouts, the captain, still nursing a chest that would ache for days, spat blood once more into the black stone and said, to no one in particular, the words that would be repeated, with growing dread, across 3 different faction war councils before the sun set twice more. "He's not looking for a war," the captain said. "He's looking for something that can actually kill him. Gods help whatever he finds." Quan Chi felt the tear in his workshop long before word of it reached Fire God Liu Kang's chamber, because Quan Chi had made the tear himself, and no sorcerer worth the title fails to notice when his own work goes catastrophically, magnificently wrong. He had been reaching, for the better part of 3 months, into the thin places between realities, not the well-worn paths between Earthrealm and Outworld and the Netherrealm that every sorcerer of any competence could walk blindfolded, but the deeper, stranger seams that ran beneath even those, places where realities not bound by the old cosmology's rules pressed close enough to touch. His purpose had been narrow and, he'd believed, achievable. Find something from outside the realm's familiar architecture, something with power enough to finally crack Raiden's insufferable patience, something Liu Kang's titans had no established counter for. A weapon, a key, something small enough to control. What he had pulled through the seam, in the half-second before it sealed itself with a violence that had thrown him bodily across his own sanctum and left both his hands smoking, had not been small, and Quan Chi understood, with the particular clarity that comes to men who have spent centuries learning to recognize when they have made an error too large to walk back, that it was not going to be controllable either. He stood now at the mouth of his own ruined ritual circle, robes singed at the hem, staring at the scorch mark where the tear had briefly, catastrophically opened, and permitted himself exactly one moment of something close to fear, before folding it away behind the mask he had worn for centuries. "Well," he said, to no one, in the particular dry register he reserved for talking himself through disasters of his own making, that could have gone better. He had felt the shape of what came through, a brief, blinding impression, gone almost as fast as it arrived, of something vast and furious and burning from the inside with 2 competing hearts, one flesh, one artificial. He had felt, too, the moment it landed, 300 miles distant, in Outworld's northern wastes, and the ripple that landing had sent through the realm's fabric. A ripple Liu Kang would certainly have felt, which meant Quan Chi now had perhaps hours, not days, before someone came looking for the source. He weighed his options with the cold efficiency of a man who had survived every previous miscalculation by never being sentimental about a lost gambit. He could not put the creature back. The seam that had pulled it through was gone, collapsed, unrepeatable. Without months more preparation he no longer had time for. He could flee the consequences of the attempt, let Liu Kang's investigation run its course, and hope it never traced back to his sanctum. Or, and this was the possibility that made something in his ancient, calculating mind quicken with real interest, he could go and see, with his own eyes, exactly what kind of weapon he had accidentally built. He chose the third option, because Quan Chi had never once, in centuries of scheming, let a catastrophe go to waste when there was still profit to be salvaged from its wreckage. He found Boros 2 hours later, in a stretch of outworld badland far from the crater where the creature had first landed, standing over the wreckage of what had, until recently, been a chitin hive outpost, one of the insectoid nests that dotted Outworld's wilder territories, generally left alone by Shao's forces on the grounds that provoking them cost more than it was worth. Boros had, apparently, decided the hive's defenders were worth testing, and the outpost now lay in ruins, chitin and broken stinger limbs scattered across scorched ground, the queen herself lying dazed but unmistakably alive, 20 yards from where Boros stood, examining a still-twitching drone, with something between clinical interest and boredom. "You are the one," Boros said, without turning, the moment Quan Chi's boots touched the outpost's outer perimeter. "The one whose fingerprints were on the door that brought me here. I can smell your kind of power on the seam it left behind. Thin, patient, borrowed. Sorcery." Quan Chi, who had not survived this long by flinching at accurate observations, permitted himself a small, unbothered smile as he approached. "You have a sharp nose for a man who fell through my workshop by accident," he said. "Quan Chi, sorcerer, of no small reputation in these realms, and, as it happens, the reason you are currently standing in Outworld, rather than wherever it is you were dying when I found you."
"I was not dying."
Boros finally turned, and there was something almost lazy in the way he did it, the unhurried confidence of a being who had long ago stopped considering most encounters a genuine risk. "I was finishing a fight I intended to lose gloriously. You interrupted the ending. I have decided, on balance, that I am not yet angry about it, because this world has proven considerably more interesting than the one I left." He studied Quan Chi with open curiosity, not the reflexive threat assessment he'd given the border scouts, but something closer to appraisal. "You reached across an unimaginable distance to pull something dangerous into your world on purpose. That is either great foolishness or great ambition. I have found, in my experience, that those two things rarely travel far apart." An astute observation. Quan Chi spread his hands, palms up, the universal gesture of a man about to propose something he expected to be underestimated. "I will not insult you by pretending the accident wasn't an accident. But accidents can become opportunities, if both parties are willing to be honest about what they want. I want leverage against a power in these realms that has, for a very long time, considered itself untouchable. You, if I read you correctly, want a fight worth the crossing you've made. I am offering you a door to exactly the kind of target you're looking for. Faster, and with considerably less wandering through insect nests, in exchange for a modest arrangement of mutual convenience." Boros regarded him for a long moment, and something in his yellow eyes glinted with an amusement that had nothing kind in it. "You want to use me," he said, without heat, as though confirming a minor point of etiquette, "as a blade against your Raiden, whoever he is. You are offering me a leash and calling it a partnership. I am offering you a shortcut. I do not need a shortcut." Boros took a single step closer, and though he made no overt threatening motion, Quan Chi felt, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, the specific animal instinct that told a very old and very dangerous man that he had badly misjudged the balance of power in a negotiation. "I have crossed the folds between entire universes on the strength of my own will, sorcerer. I do not require a guide, and I most certainly do not accept a leash from something that could not, on its very best day, survive one honest minute of what I am capable of." His voice dropped, low and almost gentle, which made it considerably more unsettling than a shout would have been. "But I will grant you this much, because you have at least been honest about your greed, which is more than I can say for most of the vermin who try to bargain with something they cannot measure. Tell me what you know. Tell me about this thing I felt the moment I arrived, vast and old and utterly still, sitting beneath everything like the keel of a ship. Tell me its name, and I will let you walk away from this conversation exactly as intact as you arrived." Quan Chi's composure did not break, but something in his ancient, Calculating eyes did flicker. Genuine surprise, the particular kind that came from having a lifetime's collected leverage, rendered instantly worthless. He had not expected this creature to have already sensed it. Few beings in the realms, even among the elder gods, spoke openly of the presence beneath the cosmology's floor, and fewer still felt it unprompted. On the very first day of their arrival, "You felt the one being," he said slowly, and for once, there was no performance in his voice, only the careful precision of a man choosing his words around something genuinely dangerous to discuss carelessly. "That is either remarkable sensitivity or a very bad sign for the rest of us, and I confess, I am not certain which." He considered, weighing what he actually knew against what he was willing to trade for free. "It is older than the elder gods, older than the realms themselves. Some say it was whole once, a single being that held all the power now scattered among the elder gods, before it tore itself apart in an act no one fully understands, and from the wound, the realms as we know them were born. It does not fight, it does not rule. It does not, as far as any scholar of the old cosmology has ever confirmed, do anything at all. It simply exists, at the root of everything, holding a structure together that would otherwise collapse into whatever it was before order existed." He paused. "No one has ever provoked it. No one has ever been foolish enough to try." Boros's smile, when it came, was slow and terrible and entirely, genuinely delighted. "Then, I will be the first," he said. Word of the Khitan outpost destruction reached Liu Kang's council within the hour, carried by a shaken border scout, and confirmed by a Lin Kuei reconnaissance drone. Sub-Zero had quietly dispatched the moment Kung Lao's request reached the temple. The images it returned, a hive nest leveled in what appeared to be minutes, a queen left alive but broken, no attempt made to conceal the trail of destruction, painted a picture that did nothing to ease the tension already gathering in the amber chamber. "He is not hiding," Sub-Zero said, arms crossed, ice pluming faintly from beneath his fingertips, in the particular reflexive way it did when he was working through a threat assessment. "A being with that kind of restraint against my soldiers." He inclined his head toward Raiden, acknowledging the account of the border scouts, though the scouts in question had been Shao's, not his own. "Does not then level an entire outpost carelessly. He is testing thresholds. He wants to know how much force this world can put in front of him before something worth his attention arrives. Which means the longer we wait to make contact, the more of Outworld he will burn through testing us," Kung Lao said. "We should have found him before Shao's next patrol does. That advantage is gone." "General Shao already knows," said Cetrion, who had joined the council quietly, robes trailing pale gold light across the amber floor, her ancient face composed in the particular stillness she wore when the weight of the realm sat heavy on her attention. "I felt his forces mobilizing the moment the Khitan hive fell. He will not tolerate an unclaimed threat operating inside his borders unchallenged, not because he fears it, but because tolerance of that kind reads, to every rival watching, as weakness. He will move to confront it directly, and soon, with considerably more than a border patrol." Liu Kang, who had listened to all of this without interruption, finally spoke, and his voice carried the particular weight of a man who had already, privately, arrived at a conclusion he did not relish. "Then we do not have the luxury of a slow approach," he said. "I had hoped to observe, to understand what this creature wants before either welcoming or opposing it. That hope is no longer realistic. General Shao's forces will reach him within the day, and whatever happens in that meeting will shape everything that follows. An alliance forged in Outworld's favor, a war that spills across every border, or worse." He rose from his seat, and the gesture alone was enough to still the room. "I will go myself, not to fight him, not yet, but to be the first voice from Earthrealm he hears, before Shao's ambition, or Quan Chi's schemes, shape his understanding of these realms into something adversarial, before we have even had the chance to offer him anything else. You would meet him alone? Raiden's brow furrowed, old caution surfacing despite the freedom his newer self carried more lightly than his former incarnation ever had. Liu Kang, we do not yet know the true limit of his power. The scouts he faced were not weak, and he dismantled them in under 2 minutes without exertion, visible enough for even Sub-Zero's drone to properly measure. I know. Liu Kang's expression did not waver. That is precisely why it must be me, and not a patrol, and not a trap. A being who has crossed entire universes searching for a worthy opponent will not respect an ambush. He will respect strength offered honestly, and a choice offered without a blade concealed behind it. I intend to give him both. He looked around the chamber, meeting each of their eyes in turn. Raiden's caution, Kung Lao's readiness, Sub-Zero's careful calculation, Cetrion's ancient patience. Prepare your own forces regardless. If I am wrong about him, we will need every one of you ready to answer for it. But let me try the door of diplomacy first, before we assume it was always going to end in war. Boros felt the approach of a genuinely significant power roughly 20 minutes before Liu Kang's golden-armored form crested the black ridge above the ruined Khitan outpost, and for the first time since his arrival, something in his chest, both hearts, flesh and crystal alike, quickened with real, unguarded anticipation. It was not the vast, unmeasurable stillness he'd felt at the very edge of his senses since the moment he'd woken in this world. That presence remained exactly as distant and exactly as patient as it had been, untouched by anything happening around it. But this was something else, a controlled, deliberate power, dense and disciplined, carried by a figure who moved like a man who had fought and won wars that mattered, and who approached now not with the hesitant caution of a scout or the arrogant confidence of a warlord's patrol, but with the calm, unhurried bearing of someone who had already decided the outcome of this meeting did not need to be violence. Quan Chi, wisely, had already made himself scarce, vanishing into whatever shadow work passed for his travel the moment the golden light of an approaching titan had registered on the horizon. A sorcerer's instinct for self-preservation that Boros found, in retrospect, entirely predictable. Liu Kang stopped 30 yards from the wreckage of the outpost, twin Dao blades still crossed at his back, unstrung, hands empty and open at his sides. A deliberate posture, and Boros noted the deliberateness of it with genuine, surprised respect. "You are not what I expected to find here," Liu Kang said, his voice carrying easily across the scorched ground, level and unhurried. "I felt the door that brought you into these realms. I felt the tremor it left in the fabric of everything I have spent a very long time rebuilding. I have come to ask you, before anything else is decided by force, what it is you actually want." Boros considered him for a long moment. The golden armor, the dragon-worked plate, the fire banked visibly behind calm eyes, the crossed blades worn like an afterthought rather than a threat. He recognized, with something that felt almost like relief, the particular bearing of a being who had genuinely earned the power he carried, rather than merely inherited or stolen it. "You are the first thing on this world to ask me a real question instead of pointing a weapon at me first," Boros said, and there was, for the first time since his arrival, something almost like genuine warmth threaded through his voice. "I respect that more than you likely expect." He gestured, one clawed hand sweeping toward the wrecked outpost behind him, toward the black horizon beyond it, toward the whole unmeasured shape of the realms he had felt pressing at the edges of his senses since the moment he woke. "I want what I have always wanted, since long before your realms existed to offer it to me. I want a fight that matters. I have felt something in this world, Fire God, something ancient and vast and utterly, maddeningly still, sitting beneath all of it, like the foundation no one is permitted to touch. His eyes glinted, and the crystalline heart beneath the crack in his armor pulsed once, visibly, gold-white with anticipation. Tell me its name. Tell me where I can find it. And I promise you, on whatever honor a conqueror like myself still carries, that I will leave the rest of your realms entirely alone. Liu Kang's expression did not change, but something behind his fire-lit eyes went very still, the particular stillness of a man realizing, in real time, exactly how large a problem had just walked into his world. You are asking me, he said slowly, to point you toward the one being. I am. No one has ever asked me that before. Liu Kang's voice had gone quiet, careful, weighing a truth he had clearly never expected to need to speak aloud, because no one who understood what it was has ever wanted to find it. Boros smiled, slow, genuine, and entirely without fear. And for the first time since the war god's fist had folded his own universe shut around him, something in his chest felt almost like being alive again. Then it is a very good thing, he said, that I am not most people. No one who understood what it was has ever wanted to find it, Liu Kang said again, quieter this time, as if repeating the words might make Boros hear the weight he'd intended them to carry the first time. You speak of it as though it were merely powerful. It is not merely powerful. It is the reason power exists at all in these realms, the source from which the elder gods themselves were, in some fashion no scholar has ever fully explained, born. To seek it out is not to seek a fight. It is to seek the foundation beneath every fight that has ever been fought here. And I do not believe you understand what happens to a foundation when something strikes it. Boros tilted his head, unbothered, studying the fire god with the patient curiosity of a man listening to a warning he had already decided not to heed. I have heard variations of that speech before, he said. Different words, different gods, always the same shape underneath. You do not understand what you are asking for. I understood it the first time a war god told me the same thing, moments before I made him understand what I was capable of instead. His voice did not rise, but something in it hardened, the amusement receding just slightly to reveal the appetite beneath it. I am not asking your permission, fire god. I am asking for information, because I have decided, out of what little courtesy I still extend to worlds I have not yet been given reason to despise, that I would rather learn your realm's geography honestly than tear it apart location by location until I stumble onto what I am looking for. Liu Kang held his gaze and did not look away and did not reach for the blades crossed at his back. And if I refuse to tell you, then I will find it anyway, Boros said, simply, without malice, the way a man states a fact about gravity. It will simply take longer, and considerably more of your world will suffer for the search. I would prefer not to. I suspect, from the care in your voice when you speak of these realms, that you would prefer that as well. He crossed his arms, the motion casual despite the mass of muscle and bone plate it moved. So, a different question then, one I suspect you are better equipped to answer honestly. If I do not go looking for your elder foundation today, if I agree, for now, to test myself against whatever this world can actually offer me first, will your realms give me a genuine fight, not soldiers who fall in 90 seconds, not scouts sent to slow me down while your real strength gathers elsewhere, an honest contest against whatever you consider your finest? Liu Kang considered this for a long moment, weighing a proposition that was, he understood clearly, both a genuine olive branch and a trap of its own particular shape. Except, and he bought time to understand this creature properly, time to prepare, time to perhaps find a way to dissuade him from the deeper, more catastrophic goal entirely. Refuse, and the alternative was almost certainly immediate, unrestrained violence, against an opponent whose true ceiling none of them had yet measured. I will not pretend that is not a fair offer, he said finally. But I will not offer myself as a diversion while my people quietly build a trap behind your back either. If you wish a genuine contest, you will have one. Honestly fought, honestly judged, on terms neither of us games in advance. But I ask something in return. His eyes held Boros's without flinching. Give me time. Not to prepare a weapon against you. I give you my word on that, for whatever that word is worth to a stranger. But time to understand what waking the one being would actually mean for every living thing across 6 realms, so that when you do eventually make your choice, you make it with full knowledge of the cost, rather than blind hunger. Something in Boros's expression shifted. Not quite respect, not yet, but something adjacent to it. The particular recalibration of a predator who has just realized his prey, understands the shape of the hunt better than expected. You are stalling me, he said, and doing it plainly enough that I could simply refuse. That is either great confidence or great foolishness. Perhaps both, Liu Kang said, and for the first time, something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. I have been told those two things rarely travel far apart. Boros laughed, a short, genuine sound, rough at the edges, the first true laugh he'd allowed himself since his arrival, and inclined his head in something that might, on a more courteous being, have passed for a bow. Very well, Fire God. You have bought yourself time, and I have bought myself a fight. I will consider that a fair trade for today. He turned, already scanning the horizon with open, hungry interest. Send me your finest then, and do try to make it interesting. I have crossed a distance no creature in your realms could properly comprehend, and I would hate for the first honest opponent I meet here to disappoint me. General Shao's column reached the ruined Kaitin outpost less than an hour later, and found, instead of the wounded, isolated intruder his scouts had reported, a fire god standing in quiet conversation with the very thing his forces had been dispatched to capture or kill. Shao did not dismount from the warbeast he rode at the head of his column, a scaled, armored creature bred for exactly this kind of show of force, until he had taken in the full scene with the flat, assessing stare of a general who had built an empire on never once being surprised by a battlefield twice. Behind him, 200 of Outworld's finest soldiers held formation, weapons ready, waiting on a word he had not yet given. Fire God, Shao said, voice carrying the particular gravel of a man who had never once in his life bothered softening a greeting for diplomacy's sake. You are standing on Outworld soil, in conversation with a creature that leveled one of my outposts within hours of its arrival. I would very much like to understand why I was not the first to be consulted about what happens to it. Because time mattered more than protocol, General, Liu Kang said, turning to face him without visible alarm, though Boros noted, with the sharp, professional interest of a being who had spent a lifetime reading the exact moment a negotiation tipped toward violence, the subtle shift in Liu Kang's stance, weight balanced now to move in either direction as needed. And because I did not believe your first instinct, faced with something this powerful, would have been conversation. You are correct, Shao said, without apology. My first instinct is rarely conversation. He finally swung down from his warbeast, boots striking black stone with a weight that carried its own quiet statement, and studied Boros directly for the first time, not with the reflexive threat assessment of a border scout, but with the calculating, appraising stare of a warlord who had spent decades learning to measure exactly how much force a given threat actually required. You destroyed a chitin hive that has resisted 3 separate extermination attempts by my own engineers. You dismantled 6 of my border scouts without killing a single one, which tells me either you are merciful, which I doubt, or you did not consider them worth the effort of killing, which I find considerably more insulting. His hand rested, loose and ready, on the haft of the massive warhammer strapped across his back. I do not care what you want from these realms. I care that you are standing uninvited in mine, and I intend to know, before this conversation ends, exactly how much force it will take to make you leave, stay, or die." Boros's smile, when it came, was slow and delighted, and entirely without the restraint he had shown the border scouts. "General," he said, "that is, without question, the most honest greeting I have received since arriving in your world. I find I like you considerably more than the sorcerer who dragged me here." He rolled one shoulder, the motion casual, and something in the crystalline heart beneath his cracked armor began, visibly, to pulse brighter. "Fire God has already promised me a genuine contest, in time, against whatever these realms consider their finest. But I confess, General, your bearing suggests you might not be willing to wait for a scheduled appointment." "I am not," Shao said flatly, and drew the warhammer from his back in a single fluid motion that sent a ripple of readiness through the 200 soldiers behind him. "I have built an empire on the principle that strength which is not tested is strength that cannot be trusted. You will be tested today, creature, by my own hand, and then I will decide what you are permitted to become in these realms." Liu Kang stepped forward, one hand raised, caution written plainly across his features. "General Shao." "Do not," Shao said, without looking at him, "presume to tell me how to defend my own borders, Fire God. You have had your conversation. Now I will have mine." He turned back to Boros, hammer held loose and easy in both hands, the stance of a man who had ended wars with that same weapon and had never once doubted its adequacy for the task. "Well, creature, or do you only fight scouts and outposts, and lose your nerve the moment something stands in front of you that can actually answer back?" Boros's laugh, this time, carried an edge sharp enough to make even the hardened soldiers in Shao's column take an involuntary half-step back. "General," he said, cracking his neck to one side with an audible pop of settling bone, the crystalline heart now blazing gold-white through the crack in his armor. "I have been waiting all day for someone on this world to finally stop talking." What followed was not, by any honest measure, a fight that either side could claim to have won cleanly, but it was, without question, the first genuine contest the realms had offered Boros since his arrival, and both combatants seemed, in their own ways, grimly satisfied by that fact alone. Shao opened with a full-force overhead swing that would have, against nearly anything else standing in Outworld's history, ended the engagement in a single stroke. The warhammer's head, forged from black meteorite iron and etched with runes that channeled Shao's own considerable brutal strength, came down with a force that cratered the ground on impact and sent a shockwave rippling outward hard enough to stagger soldiers 30 yards back. Boros was not there when it landed. He had moved, not teleported, not blinked, simply moved with a speed that outstripped the eye's ability to properly track it, and was already inside Shao's guard, one fist driving upward into the general's exposed ribs, with enough force to lift a lesser combatant clean off the ground. Shao did not lift off the ground. He staggered, armor cracking audibly along one side, breath driven out in a single explosive grunt, but his boots held their footing, and the counterswing he brought around a half-second later, the hammer's haft rather than its head, a brutal, close-range check rather than a killing blow, caught Boros across the jaw with enough force to snap his head sideways and draw a thin line of dark blood along his cheek. Both combatants staggered back a step, and both, in the same instant, began to laugh. "You hit like something worth remembering," Boros said, wiping the blood from his jaw with the back of one hand, and studying the dark smear with something like genuine, surprised pleasure. "I have not bled from a first exchange in longer than I care to admit. You strike harder than anything I have faced since the war against the last false god who thought Outworld was his for the taking," Shao said, resetting his stance, hammer already rising again, armor still cracked but his footing entirely unshaken. "Which means, creature, that I am no longer merely testing you. I am going to enjoy ending you." They came together again, and this time the exchange did not stop after a single strike. It became a genuine, sustained contest, Shao's brutal, ground-shaking power meeting Boros's speed and precision in a rhythm that tore the already ruined outpost apart around them, sent Shao's soldiers scrambling back to a safer perimeter, and drew, from the growing crowd of Special Forces operatives and Lin Kuei scouts who had quietly gathered on the surrounding ridgeline to observe, a tense, uneasy silence. Raiden, watching from the ridge with Kung Lao and Sub-Zero at his side, felt the specific gravity of the moment settle over him like a held breath. "He is not fighting at his full strength," Raiden said quietly, watching Boros duck beneath a hammer swing that would have taken his head clean off a lesser opponent, and answer with a strike that sent Shao skidding backward through the outpost's last standing wall. "Look at him. He is enjoying this too much to end it quickly. He is testing exactly how far General Shao can push him before he needs to answer with everything he actually has." "And what happens?" Sub-Zero asked, voice low, ice pluming faintly and involuntarily from his clenched fists. "When General Shao finally pushes him that far?" No one on the ridge had an answer. Below them, in the wreckage of the Kaitin outpost, General Shao, bleeding now from a cut above one eye, armor cracked in a dozen places, breath coming hard, but his grip on the warhammer as steady as it had been at the fight's opening, planted his feet, gathered every ounce of the brutal, unyielding strength that had built and held an empire, and swung with a force that made the very air scream. Boros caught the hammer's head in one open palm and stopped it dead. The silence that followed was absolute. "That," Boros said quietly, and for the first time since the fight began, all trace of amusement had drained from his voice, replaced by something colder, more focused, more genuinely interested, "was the hardest anything on this world has hit me since I arrived." He tightened his grip on the hammer's head, and Shao, jaw set, refusing to release it, refusing to yield an inch, even as the metal groaned audibly under a pressure it had never once in its long, brutal history been asked to withstand, met his eyes without flinching. "Then you have not yet seen everything I am capable of, creature," Shao said, teeth bared, blood running freely down one side of his face. Boros's smile returned, slow and sharp, and entirely without mercy this time. "Good," he said. "Then show me." Shao released the hammer half a second before Boros crushed it outright. A tactical retreat rather than a surrender, executed with the same brutal efficiency that had built his empire, and used the sudden absence of resistance to drive a knee up into Boros's exposed midsection, with enough force to crack stone beneath both their feet. Boros grunted, more surprise than pain, and answered with a backhand that sent Shao skidding 30 feet across the ruined outpost, plowing a furrow through broken chitin and scorched earth, before he came to a stop against the crumbled remains of the Chitin Queen's throne chamber. For a long moment, General Shao did not move, and the silence on the ridgeline stretched taut enough that Kung Lao's hand drifted, unbidden, toward the hook swords at his hip. Then Shao laughed, a low, rasping sound, blood in his teeth, and pushed himself upright. "You hold back," he said, spitting to one side, eyes never leaving Boros across the wreckage between them. "I felt it in that strike. You could have ended me there. You did not." "No," Boros agreed, and something in his voice had shifted again, the predator's amusement giving way to a more careful, more genuine calculation. "I did not." He rolled his shoulders, testing the ache where Shao's knee had connected, and found, with faint surprise, that it actually hurt, a rare enough sensation that he took a moment to properly register it. "You are the first thing in this world to make me bleed on the first exchange, General. I find I am curious how much further you can push, before your body simply cannot keep pace with your will. That is worth more to me right now than an ending. Then you have grievously misjudged how much further this body intends to go." Shao rose fully, Warhammer's cracked head dragging a groove through the earth as he lifted it, and around him, visible even to the watchers on the ridge, something began to gather. A dense, red-black energy coiling around the hammer's haft, the particular signature of Outworld's oldest and cruelest war magic, the kind Shao rarely needed to invoke because his raw strength alone had, until this day, been sufficient for every threat his empire had faced. You wished for something worth the crossing you made. I am going to give you exactly that, creature, and you are going to regret asking. The strike that followed tore the remaining structure of the Kaiten outpost apart entirely. A wide, sweeping arc of the hammer trailing crimson-black energy that did not merely displace air but tore reality along its path, leaving a visible scar of raw force hanging in the atmosphere for a full second after the swing completed. Boros did not attempt to catch this one. He moved instead, faster than the strike itself, circling inside its arc with a precision that spoke of centuries spent learning exactly how to read the geometry of a killing blow, and answered with both fists driven simultaneously into Shao's exposed torso, a strike backed, for the first time since the contest began, by genuine, undisguised power. The shockwave from the impact flattened every remaining wall of the outpost, sent Shao's own soldiers scrambling for cover 100 yards back, and drove General Shao himself clean through 3 separate rock formations before he finally came to rest, half buried in rubble, breathing hard, armor entirely shattered across his chest, but, Raiden noted with grim, reluctant respect from the ridgeline, still, unmistakably, alive. Boros stood amid the wreckage, chest heaving with something that was not quite exertion and not quite exhilaration, and looked down at the general with an expression that had, for the first time since his arrival in these realms, something genuinely close to admiration in it. "You survived that," he said, and there was no mockery in the observation, only fact. "Most things I have hit that hard do not." Shao pushed himself up out of the rubble, one arm hanging useless at his side, ribs visibly, badly broken beneath torn armor, and forced himself upright through sheer, stubborn will. "I built an empire," he said, each word costing him visible effort, "on refusing to stay down for lesser men. I will not begin making exceptions for a stranger who fell out of the sky." Boros studied him for a long moment, and then, deliberately, unmistakably, took a single step back. Not retreat, but restraint. A conscious choosing not to press an advantage that both of them understood was now entirely his to press. "Then let this be where we end it, General," he said. "Not because you have lost. You have not truly, not in the way that matters to a warrior like yourself, but because I find I would rather have you as something other than a corpse in the wreckage of your own outpost. You are the first genuine test these realms have offered me. I would prefer to see what you become, given time to heal, than to end the story here out of impatience." Shao held his gaze for a long, silent moment, breathing hard, blood running freely down one side of his ruined armor, weighing an offer that every instinct built across decades of ruthless conquest told him to refuse on principle. "You are offering me mercy," he said finally, and the word came out flat, almost accusing. "I am offering you a rematch, General, once your body has caught up to your will," Boros said, and something in his voice made it clear the distinction mattered to him more than Shao likely understood. "Mercy is for things I have already decided are beneath me. You are not beneath me. You are, so far, the single most interesting thing this world has offered, second only to the presence I still intend to find beneath all of it. I would be a fool to end that early, out of nothing but bloodlust." 50 miles to the east, in a chamber carved from bone and netherrealm ash that had no business existing this far into Outworld's territory, Havik listened to the account of the fight, relayed breathlessly by a red dragon informant who had watched the exchange from a safe distance and fled the moment the outpost's remaining walls came down, and began, slowly, to laugh. It was not a pleasant laugh. It never was, filtered as it was through the jawless metal grill that had replaced whatever remained of his original face. But there was a particular quality to it now, a rising, delighted hysteria that made even the informant, a mercenary who had survived worse things than Havik's moods purely through professional detachment, take an involuntary step toward the chamber's exit. "Order," Havik said, to no one and to everyone, spreading his arms wide in a gesture that encompassed the whole unseen sweep of the realms beyond his chamber's walls. "Blessed, beautiful, unraveling order. Do you understand what has happened today? Do you understand what has been dropped into the careful, tidy little architecture Liu Kang has spent years rebuilding, brick by miserable brick?" He turned, loose-jointed and unnervingly quick, to the small cluster of cult acolytes gathered at the chamber's edge, robed and silent, awaiting instruction. "A creature has arrived that does not care for realms, does not care for factions, does not care for the sacred rituals of Mortal Kombat, that every single power in these 6 realms has spent centuries pretending are the only acceptable shape violence is permitted to take. He does not fight for Earthrealm. He does not fight for Outworld. He fights because chaos itself called to him across an unimaginable distance, and he answered." His laughter rose again, sharper this time. "This is the most honest thing to happen to these realms in a generation." "Deceiver," one of the acolytes said carefully, using the honorific the cult reserved for Havik alone. "General Shao's forces are already mobilizing further. If this creature is not contained, Outworld's entire military structure may pivot to hunt him, which would leave gaps," Havik finished, delight sharpening into something closer to genuine focused interest. "Beautiful, glorious gaps. In every carefully maintained border and truce these realms currently pretend are permanent." Shao's attention consumed hunting a creature he cannot actually kill. Liu Kang's attention consumed trying to prevent that creature from finding something that should never, under any circumstance, be found. Raiden's precious non-interference principles strained past whatever fragile threshold he has rebuilt them to since the last Titan War. He turned back to the informant, eyes bright behind the metal grill. "Tell me, when the creature spoke of what he was actually searching for, this ancient, unmeasurable stillness he claims to have felt the moment he arrived, did Liu Kang say a name?" The informant hesitated, and Havik's patience, thin at the best of times, evaporated entirely. "Did he say a name? The one being," the informant said quickly, flinching back. "The fire god called it the one being, said it was older than the elder gods themselves." For a long moment, even Havik's manic energy stilled, replaced by something that, on any other face, might have passed for genuine, uncalculating awe. "Oh," he said, very quietly, and then, building again into something closer to reverent delight. "Oh, do you understand what that creature is actually proposing? Not a war between realms, not a contest for a throne. He intends to walk to the very foundation of everything that exists here and knock on its door." He began pacing, robes trailing ash across the bone floor, mind visibly racing through implications the acolytes could barely follow. If he succeeds, if that stillness beneath everything actually stirs, actually answers, every structure these realms have built atop it, every elder god's authority, every sacred rule of combat, every tired, orderly truce, becomes, in an instant, negotiable again. He stopped and turned back to his gathered acolytes with an expression of pure, unhinged purpose. "We are not going to stop this creature. We are not going to help him either. Not openly, not yet. We are going to watch. We are going to gather every scrap of information we can about what he is capable of and where his search leads him next. And we are going to be positioned, when the foundation of these realms finally cracks, to be the ones who decide what grows in the space that opens up." His grin widened behind the metal grill, sharp and hungry. "Send word to our contacts among the Black Dragon. Chaos of this magnitude is not a threat to be contained. It is an opportunity to be harvested." Back at the ruined outpost, as General Shao's soldiers began the grim work of recovering their fallen general onto a transport litter, Shao himself protesting the indignity with every ounce of stubborn breath his broken ribs allowed, Liu Kang approached Boros with careful, measured steps, his expression unreadable, but his bearing considerably more guarded than it had been before the fight began. "You showed restraint," he said, "where you did not need to. I did not expect that from a being who described himself as a conqueror the moment we met. Do not mistake restraint for softness, Fire God." Boros flexed the hand that had caught Shao's hammer, testing an ache that had not fully faded. "I conquered 100 systems by knowing precisely when killing something served me, and precisely when it did not. General Shao serves me considerably more as a living rival than as a corpse. I suspect in time he will understand that better than you do right now." He turned, studying Liu Kang with renewed, sharpened interest. "You held yourself back from that fight entirely. You could have joined him. You did not." "It was not my fight to join," Liu Kang said simply, "and I do not believe intervening would have changed its outcome, only its cost." He held Boros's gaze steadily. "You have your rematch, someday, with General Shao. You have proven, today, that these realms can offer you something worth your patience. I ask again, then for the time I asked for at the start of this, time to understand, properly, what you intend, before you take the next step toward the one being." Boros considered this for a long moment, the earlier hunger banked now behind something more thoughtful, more genuinely weighing the request rather than dismissing it outright. "You have earned a measure of my patience today, Fire God, more than I expected to grant anyone in these realms so soon." He looked past Liu Kang, toward the horizon, toward the direction where that vast, ancient stillness still sat, unmoved and unmeasured, at the edge of every sense he possessed. "I will give you your time, not out of mercy, and not out of trust. I extend neither easily, and I have learned across 100 conquered worlds that both are frequently mistaken for weakness by those who receive them. I give it to you because a fight with your General Shao has reminded me that I have crossed into a world with genuine substance in it, and substance, Fire God, deserves to be properly understood before it is discarded." His yellow eyes glinted, sharp and patient, and utterly without doubt. "But do not mistake patience for abandonment of purpose. I will find the one being, eventually, whether these realms guide me to it or force me to search alone. The only question that remains open, Fire God, is how much of your world still stands intact by the time I do." Sonya Blade had commanded soldiers through 3 world-ending crises, 2 timeline collapses, and 1 memorably catastrophic negotiation with an elder god who insisted on speaking exclusively in riddles, and she had, across all of it, developed a very particular tolerance for the word patience when it came out of Liu Kang's mouth. She did not have much of it left by the time his summons reached Special Forces headquarters. "You gave him time," she said, pacing the length of the briefing room while a hologram of the ruined chitin outpost rotated slowly above the central table, casting pale blue light across the gathered officers. "Liu Kang, with respect, and I do mean that, mostly, you gave a being who can crack General Shao's ribs with a backhand and shrug off an energy lance like a light breeze time, on the strength of a promise that he'll behave himself while he decides whether to go looking for something you yourself just described as older than every god currently holding a throne in these realms. I gave him time because the alternative was war today, without preparation, against an opponent whose true ceiling we still have not measured," Liu Kang said, standing at the head of the table with the particular stillness he wore, when he had already made peace with a decision others were still arguing against. General Shao pushed him to something close to genuine effort. and Boros still held back. I do not know how much further he has to give. Do you? Sonya's jaw tightened, because she didn't, and hated that she didn't. No, which is exactly my point. We're negotiating a ceasefire with a variable we can't actually measure, based on his word alone, and his word came from a being who introduced himself as a conqueror of 100 systems. She stopped pacing, planted both hands on the table, and looked up at the rotating hologram. I've read every scrap of intel Sub-Zero's drone pulled from that fight. He wasn't just holding back strength, he was enjoying himself. That's not the profile of something that negotiates in good faith long term. That's the profile of something that's currently entertained, and will stop being entertained the moment something better comes along. That may be true, Cetrion said quietly from her seat near the room's far wall, robes pooled around her like still water. But I would offer a different reading of the same evidence, General Blade. A being who has crossed the folds between universes on nothing but appetite and will does not typically extend restraint to opponents he considers beneath him. He extended it twice today, once to your border scouts, once to General Shao, at the very moment he had every advantage. That is not merely entertainment. That is, I believe, something closer to respect, offered by a creature who has likely not had cause to feel it in a very long time. Her ancient eyes lifted to meet Sonya's across the room. Respect can be built upon. It is a considerably better foundation than fear. Respect doesn't stop him from finding this one being the second he gets bored of respecting us, Sonya shot back, though with less heat than before. Cetrion's calm had a way of doing that to a room, sanding the edges off arguments that had arrived sharp. What actually happens if he finds it? Nobody in this room has given me a straight answer to that yet, and I've asked 3 times. The silence that followed was answer enough. We do not know, Liu Kang admitted finally, and the admission cost him something visible, a rare crack in the composure he'd carried through the entire briefing. No scholar in 6 realms has recorded what waking the one being would mean, because no one has ever come close enough to test it. What we know is fragments, that it is the source from which the elder gods themselves emerged in some fashion never fully explained, that it has remained utterly still and unresponsive since before recorded history in any realm, and that its stillness is, as far as anyone can determine, the reason the current structure of reality holds together at all. He met Sonya's eyes squarely. I do not know if Boros striking it would end in his death, in its awakening, in nothing at all, or in something no one in this room has the vocabulary to properly imagine. That is precisely why I bought us time, General. Not to build a weapon against him, to understand, if we can, exactly how much is actually at stake before we commit to any course at all, fighting him, aiding him, or standing aside. Sonya exhaled slowly, some of the fight going out of her shoulders, though not the wariness. Fine, time, but I want eyes on him constantly. Special Forces assets, not just Lin Kuei ghosts who report back on their own schedule. And I want a contingency plan drawn up for what happens if time runs out before we've learned anything useful. She looked around the table. Because Havik's already moving. Our informants inside the Netherrealm cult picked up chatter within hours of the fight ending. He's reaching out to the Black Dragon. And if the deceiver thinks there's profit to be made in whatever chaos this creature leaves in his wake, I promise you, he is not the only faction in these realms who's going to start looking for an angle. She was, as it happened, entirely correct, though the particular angle Kano was already working from was considerably less philosophical than Havik's. The Black Dragon's safe house occupied a converted smuggling depot on the edge of Outworld's lawless border markets, a sprawl of tin-roofed stalls and unlicensed weapons dealers that General Shao's administration tolerated, grudgingly, because shutting it down entirely tended to just relocate the problem somewhere harder to watch. Kano sat with his boots up on a crate of stolen Lin Kuei tech, cybernetic eye whirring faintly as it processed the grainy drone footage Havik's people had shared through an intermediary neither side would ever formally acknowledge working with. "You're telling me," Kano said, to the room in general, "that some horned bloke fell out of the sky, cracked Shao's ribs like breadsticks, and then just let him live? Out of the goodness of his big alien heart?" "Two hearts, according to the intel," said Aaron Black, leaning against the depot's far wall, arms crossed, hat tipped low against the harsh midday light, bleeding through gaps in the corrugated roof. "One's some kind of crystal thing. Glows when he powers up. Not exactly subtle. Right. Two hearts, restraint, and apparently a personal quest to go punch God." Kano swung his boots down off the crate and leaned forward, cybernetic eye narrowing on the footage. "You know what I see when I look at that, Aaron? I see a weapon nobody's currently holding the leash on. Quan Chi tried and got told to sod off. Shao tried and got his ribs caved in for the trouble. Liu Kang's playing nice and buying time, which is fire god for, I don't actually have a plan yet." He grinned, gold tooth catching the light. "That's a gap in the market, mate. And I did not claw my way to running this operation by ignoring gaps in the market." "You're thinking of approaching him." Aaron's tone carried the particular flatness of a man who had worked with Kano long enough to recognize a terrible idea forming in real time, and had long since stopped bothering to sound surprised by it. "The bloke that put a general who's crushed skulls for breakfast through 3 rock formations." "I'm thinking," Kano said, standing, cracking his knuckles with the particular relish of a man who genuinely enjoyed the sound, that a creature who just spent his first day in these realms getting lectured at by every high and mighty power structure going, fire gods, elder goddesses, generals who think restraint is charity, might actually appreciate someone who doesn't waste his time with speeches. Someone who just tells him plainly what's on offer and lets him decide. He picked up a data slate, scrolling through a hastily assembled dossier that was, Aaron noted, mostly speculation dressed up as intelligence. Word is he's after information. Realms, factions, who's actually worth fighting, and who's just noise. "We know this place better than anybody. Better than Shao's rigid patrol routes. Better than the Lin Kuei's paranoid secrecy. We know where the real bodies are buried, literally and otherwise." Kano's grin widened. "I'm not proposing we fight him, Aaron. I'm proposing we sell him a map. And in exchange, maybe he does us a favor or two along the way. The kind of favor a bloke who can crack a general's ribs is uniquely qualified to provide." Aaron Black was quiet for a long moment, weighing the plan against every instinct built across a career of watching overconfident men reach for things far above their actual grasp. "And if he decides the Black Dragon's not worth the conversation," he said finally, "and decides we're just noise too?" Kano's grin faltered, just slightly, before he covered it with a shrug that carried more confidence than he currently felt. "Then we'll have learned something valuable about him, won't we?" From a safe distance, he tossed the data slate to Aaron. "Get me an approach. Quiet, careful, no Havik theatrics. I want to be in a room with this thing before Shao's people finish licking their wounds and decide the smart play is locking down every border in Outworld." The approach, when it came 2 days later, found Boros exactly where the Black Dragon's scouts had tracked him, a stretch of high desert on Outworld's western edge, far from any settlement, where he had spent the intervening days, doing something that had genuinely puzzled the Special Forces operatives assigned to observe him from a careful distance. Nothing at all, by any conventional measure. He sat, mostly, on a wind-scoured outcropping of black stone, watching the horizon with the patient, unblinking focus of a being recalibrating his understanding of a world that had, against every expectation, proven considerably more layered than he'd first assumed. He was not, in fact, doing nothing. He was listening to the faint, ever-present pull of the one being's stillness at the edge of his senses, cataloging its exact location relative to his own, with the meticulous patience of a hunter who had learned, across 100 conquered worlds, that the best prey was rarely caught by rushing. Kano approached alone, deliberately, hands visible, moving with the loose, unbothered swagger of a man who had talked his way out of considerably worse situations than this one, and firmly believed his own confidence was the sharpest weapon he carried. "Figured I'd find you sulking somewhere with a view," Kano said, stopping a respectful but not fearful distance away, thumbs hooked into his belt. "Name's Kano. Run an operation round these parts that specializes in information other people would rather stayed buried. Word is you're in the market for exactly that." Boros did not turn immediately, though Kano did not doubt for a second that his approach had been tracked from considerably further away than he'd have liked. "You are not a soldier," Boros said eventually, tilting his head just enough to regard the newcomer with mild, assessing curiosity. "Not a sorcerer. Not one of the fire god's disciplined faithful. What are you then, that you approach me alone, unarmed, in the middle of a wasteland?" "I'm a businessman," Kano said, grin widening. "And in my experience, the fellas at the top of a food chain, the generals, the gods, the fire whatever he is, they're all playing a longer game than you'd think. Careful. Political. Every word they say to you's been weighed 6 times before it leaves their mouth. Me?" He spread his hands, palms up. "I just tell you what I actually know, and what I want for it. No speeches about the fate of 6 realms. No lectures about restraint, just information, honestly priced." Something in Boros's expression shifted. Not quite amusement, but a flicker of genuine interest. The particular attention a predator pays to something that has, against expectation, said something true. "And what is it you believe I want to know, businessman, that the fire god has not already told me?" "Everything he's not telling you," Kano said, and had the good sense to let the words land before continuing. "You want the one being. Fine, your business, not mine to judge. But you're operating on a map with half the roads blacked out, because Liu Kang and his lot only tell you what serves keeping you patient and cooperative. I know where the old shrines are, the places even the elder gods don't visit anymore, places that might actually hold a clue how close you can get before something notices you coming. I know which factions are already circling this whole mess like vultures, and which ones might actually be worth your time to talk to before you waste effort on the ones who aren't. I know things about this world's geography that took decades to learn, and that nobody in a golden robe is ever going to hand you for free." He let the pitch settle, then added, almost as an afterthought, with the practiced casualness of a man delivering the actual point, "And in exchange, all I want is your word that when the dust settles on whatever you end up doing to this place, the Black Dragon's got a friend standing in the wreckage, instead of an enemy." Boros studied him for a long, silent moment, and Kano, to his credit, did not flinch under the scrutiny, though something in his cybernetic eyes whirring betrayed a heartbeat rate considerably faster than his posture suggested. "You are the first creature in this world to approach me with nothing but plain greed," Boros said finally, and there was, unmistakably, something like genuine amusement in it now. "No claim to virtue. No pretense of protecting your realms from me. Simply an offer, honestly priced as you say." He rose from the outcropping, and though he made no threatening motion, the sheer scale of him unfolding to full height was enough to make even Kano's practiced confidence waver, just slightly. "I find I respect that more than I expected to. Very well, businessman. Bring me what you know. I will judge its worth for myself, and pay accordingly. Though I warn you now, if I learn you have wasted my time with lies dressed as information, the price I extract in return will not be the kind your operation can afford." Kano's grin returned, sharper now, edged with the particular satisfaction of a gambit that had, against real odds, paid off. "Wouldn't dream of it," he said. "Give me 2 days. I'll have a proper meeting arranged." someplace private, away from prying golden-armored eyes. He turned to go, then paused, glancing back with something almost like genuine curiosity, breaking through the salesman's polish. "Can I ask you something?" "Off the record." Businessman to businessman. Boros inclined his head. "Permission granted." "This thing you're hunting," Kano said. "The one being. Every single person I've talked to about it, and I've talked to a lot of scared people the last 2 days, describes it the same way. Doesn't fight, doesn't rule, doesn't do anything at all, hasn't for longer than anyone can measure. What happens if you finally find it, and it just doesn't fight back? What's a conqueror do with a war nobody on the other side shows up for?" For the first time since his arrival in these realms, something flickered across Boros's expression that was not hunger, and was not amusement, and lingered a beat too long to be dismissed as nothing at all. "I have asked myself the same question," he admitted quietly, "more times than I would care to count." He looked past Kano, toward the horizon, toward that vast, patient, unmeasurable stillness that had not moved, had not reacted, had not so much as acknowledged his existence since the moment he first felt it. "I suppose, businessman, that I intend to find out." The meeting Kano promised took shape in a derelict trading post, 2 days' walk from the high desert outcropping, a low, sand-scoured structure that had once served smugglers moving contraband between Outworld's border markets and the more lawless stretches beyond General Shao's easy reach, now repurposed with the particular efficiency of an organization that had learned, across years of operating in the margins, exactly how to make an unremarkable building defensible. Boros arrived alone, as arranged, folding his considerable frame through a doorway built for considerably smaller visitors, and found Kano waiting with a spread of data slates, hand-drawn maps, and, Boros noted with something between amusement and reluctant respect, an actual, physical ledger, ink-stained and well-worn, the kind of careful record-keeping that suggested the Black Dragon's information dealing was a genuinely serious operation, rather than the improvisation he'd half expected. "Right," Kano said, gesturing to a low table cluttered with his collected intelligence. "Let's start with the useful stuff, and work our way down to the stuff that'll cost you extra." He tapped the largest of the hand-drawn maps, a sprawling representation of terrain Boros did not recognize. Jagged mountains rendered in careful obsessive detail, dotted with small marks he assumed indicated locations of significance. "This is the old world, not Outworld as it stands now. The bones underneath it, the places that existed before the realms got carved up into the neat little territories your fire god friend likes to talk about. Every scholar worth listening to agrees the one being's influence runs deepest in places like these. Old shrines, pre-elder god ruins, spots where the boundary between what your realms call reality and whatever existed before it gets thin enough that even ordinary folk feel something wrong in their bones if they wander too close." He pointed to a cluster of marks deep in the mountain range's heart. "Most of them are useless, old superstition, local legend, nothing behind it. But 3 of these," he tapped each in turn, "have a pattern of confirmed strangeness serious enough that even the Elder God's own scholars have flagged them as places worth avoiding. If your foundation's got a door anywhere accessible to something like you, businessman's honest bet says it's one of these 3. Boros studied the map with genuine, focused interest, tracing the marked locations with one clawed finger. "You spoke, when we first met, of factions worth my time, and factions that were merely noise," he said. "I would hear that assessment now, in full." Kano leaned back, considering how to frame the next part carefully, not out of any newfound scruple, but because he understood, with the sharp instinct of a man who'd survived a career built on exactly this kind of information brokering, that an inaccurate assessment here could cost him considerably more than money. Fire god Liu Kang and his lot, Raiden, Kung Lao, the whole Titan enforcement crew, They're your biggest obstacle and, ironically, probably your safest bet if you actually want information without strings attached. Liu Kang doesn't lie, which either makes him useless to you or the single most valuable source in these realms, depending on how you look at it. He's not going to tell you where the shrines are because he thinks telling you is the same as helping you get there. But he won't feed you false intel to slow you down either. That's just not how he operates. He shifted to the next point. General Shao's out of commission for another week, minimum, but don't count him out of this equation. Man's stubborn as bedrock, and word is, he's already planning that rematch you offered him whether his ribs have finished healing or not. Watch him. Not because he's your enemy, because he might genuinely become the closest thing you've got to an ally in this whole mess. Once his pride's caught up with his curiosity, and the sorcerer, Boros said. Quan Chi. Kano's expression soured, the particular disgust of a professional recognizing an amateur's mess. Snake. Don't trust a word out of his mouth. Don't take a favor from him without pricing in the betrayal that's coming eventually. And watch your back around any door he offers to open for you. Man's specialty is making other people's ambitions serve his own, and he's had centuries of practice at it. He tapped the ledger. But here's the part you actually need to hear, businessman. There's a fourth player in this whole mess I haven't mentioned yet, and depending on how things shake out, he might end up mattering more than any of the others. Havik, Boros said, and something in Kano's expression flickered with genuine surprise. You've heard of him already. I have heard the name mentioned, in passing, by soldiers who did not realize I was listening. Boros's eyes narrowed slightly. Tell me what makes him worth my attention. Havik's the deceiver, Kano said. Runs a cult out of the Netherrealm that worships chaos itself. Thinks every stable structure in these realms, every truce, every ordered kingdom, is a lie worth burning down for the sake of watching what grows in the ashes. Most factions treat him like a mad dog to be kept on a chain. Problem is, the chain's gotten looser lately. And word through channels I trust is that he's positively giddy about your arrival. Thinks you're the best chance chaos has had in a generation. Kano's expression turned genuinely grim, the salesman's polish dropping for a rare moment of unvarnished honesty. He's not going to fight you, businessman. He's not going to try to stop you or use you the clumsy way Quan Chi tried. He's going to watch and wait and position himself to profit off whatever mess is left behind once you're done doing whatever it is you came here to do. That kind of patience, from someone that unhinged, that's the part that should worry you more than an army ever could. Boros considered this in silence for a long moment, turning the information over with the same careful attention he'd given the map. You have been thorough, businessman, he said finally, more thorough than I expected. He reached into a fold of his tattered cape and produced, to Kano's visible, startled surprise, a small, dense fragment of something that pulsed faintly with residual energy. A shard broken, Kano would later learn, from the war god's own gauntlet in the final exchange before Boros's arrival in these realms. Payment, Boros said, setting it on the table between them. I do not know what value it holds in your economy, but I suspect a fragment of a weapon capable of ending gods will find a buyer somewhere in these realms, if you are as skilled a businessman as you claim. Kano's cybernetic eye whirred, scanning the fragment's energy signature, and his grin, genuine this time, unguarded, spread slowly across his face. Businessman, he said, I think this might be the start of a beautiful arrangement. 300 miles north, in the ice-carved silence of the Lin Kuei Temple, Sub-Zero stood before his assembled council of Grand Masters and delivered a report that had, over the course of its telling, visibly unsettled even the most stoic among them. The intelligence from our drones and infiltrators paints a picture more complicated than a simple threat assessment, he said, standing before a wide viewing crystal that displayed, in slow rotation, the gathered footage of Boros's activities across the past week. The fight with Shao's scouts, the confrontation at the Kaitin outpost, The quiet, patient watching he'd done since. He is not indiscriminately violent. He has shown restraint toward those he considers beneath serious engagement, genuine respect toward those who test him honestly, and, this is the detail I find most concerning, a capacity for patience that suggests intelligence considerably beyond a simple engine of destruction. He gestured, and the display shifted to the trading post where Kano's meeting had taken place. Footage gathered from a Lin Kuei operative who had shadowed the Black Dragon leader's movements out of pure professional caution. He is now gathering information deliberately, from multiple sources, cross-referencing what he learns before acting on it. That is not the behavior of a mindless weapon. That is the behavior of a conqueror conducting a proper campaign. "You speak of him with something close to admiration, Grandmaster," said one of the older council members, a stern woman named Frost, who had earned her seat through decades of disciplined service and had never once, in Sub-Zero's memory, extended admiration to anything she considered a threat to the clan's interests. "I speak of him with respect for an accurate assessment of danger," Sub-Zero corrected, though something in his tone acknowledged the observation was not entirely wrong. The Lin Kuei have survived centuries of upheaval by never once underestimating an opponent's intelligence, even when his methods appear, on the surface, purely physical. "I do not believe Boros can be contained through force alone, should containment ever become necessary. I believe, if this creature is to be stopped or redirected, it will require understanding him, his history, his motivations, the shape of what he actually wants beyond the immediate hunger for a fight." "And what does the Fire God's Council believe he wants?" Frost asked. "Liu Kang believes he genuinely intends to seek out the one being, given time," Sub-Zero said. "I am inclined to agree, based on everything I have observed, which means our council faces a choice that extends beyond simple threat containment. If this creature succeeds in provoking a response from something that has not stirred since before the Elder Gods themselves existed, the consequences will not respect the borders our clan has spent centuries carefully navigating. Whatever we choose to do, aid him, oppose him, or remain apart from the conflict entirely, must be chosen with full understanding that neutrality itself may not be an option much longer." The council chamber fell into a long, heavy silence, the particular weight of leaders confronting a threat that did not fit any of their established doctrines. "There is another consideration, Grandmaster," Frost said finally, choosing her words with visible care. "Our clan's history with reckless power is not a distant memory. We have both, in our own ways, paid the price of masters who reached for strength beyond their wisdom to wield it." She held his gaze, and Sub-Zero understood, without her needing to say it directly, that she was speaking of Bihan, of the long shadow the Lin Kuei's former Grandmaster had cast across the clan's more recent history, of lessons paid for in blood that the council had sworn never to forget. "If this creature is, as you say, intelligent and deliberate rather than simply monstrous, does that make him more dangerous? Or does it make him someone who might actually be reasoned with, the way our former Grandmaster, in the end, could not be?" Sub-Zero considered the question with genuine, careful weight, watching the display crystal continue its slow rotation through footage of a being who had, across a single week, shown restraint, respect, curiosity, and an appetite for violence that had not once, in any of the footage gathered, tipped into indiscriminate cruelty. "I do not know yet, Elder Frost," he admitted finally, "but I intend to find out before this clan commits to any course we cannot walk back from. Increase our surveillance, quietly. I want eyes on every faction currently maneuvering around him. The Black Dragon's new arrangement, Havik's cult, General Shao's recovery. Because I suspect the true danger in this situation will not come from Boros acting alone. It will come from the moment one of these other players decides they have found a way to use him, and he decides he no longer sees the value in patience. Far to the south, in the amber chamber where the whole tangled situation had first come into focus a week earlier, Liu Kang stood alone before the wide basin of still water, watching a reflection that had, in the days since his conversation with Boros, grown steadily more difficult to interpret. Cetrion found him there in the deep quiet of the evening hour, her presence announced only by the faint rustle of her robes across the amber floor. "You are troubled," she said, not a question. I gave him time to understand what waking the one being would mean, Liu Kang said, without turning from the basin. I intended that time to work in our favor, to give us space to find a way to dissuade him, or contain him, or at the very least prepare for the worst possibility. Instead, I watch him spend that time growing more capable, more informed, more deeply entangled with factions across these realms, each of whom sees in him an opportunity rather than a threat. He shook his head slowly. I wonder now if I bought us time at all, Cetrion, or if I simply gave him the space to become considerably harder to stop. Cetrion moved to stand beside him, looking down into the basin's still surface, where the water showed, faintly, the shape of Boros seated once more upon his outcropping of black stone, studying Kano's map by the light of a fire he had not needed to build for warmth. I have watched the turning of these realms for longer than any being currently walking them, Fire God, she said quietly, and I have learned, across that long watching, that beings who arrive with pure destructive hunger, and nothing else, rarely survive long enough to become a genuine threat to the deeper order of things. Their hunger consumes them before it consumes anything else. This creature is different. He listens, he weighs. He has, in the space of a single week, shown more genuine curiosity about the shape and cost of what he intends to do than most conquerors show across entire campaigns. She turned to face him. I do not say this to comfort you, Liu Kang. I say it because I believe it changes what our response must actually be. A mindless weapon can only be stopped or destroyed. A being capable of genuine reflection can, perhaps, still be reached, if we are willing to offer him something more compelling than fear or force. Liu Kang asked quietly, if nothing in these realms proves compelling enough to turn him from a path that could unravel everything you and I have spent our long lives protecting. Cetrion was silent for a long moment, her ancient eyes fixed on the basin's rippling surface, on the distant, patient figure it reflected. Then, Fire God, she said finally, we had better hope that whatever the one being actually is, it proves considerably harder to wake than legend suggests. Because I do not believe, watching him now, that anything in these 6 realms is going to stop him from trying. General Shao left the healing chambers of his own fortress 6 days after his ribs had been set, against the explicit, increasingly exasperated protests of the physicians who had rebuilt them, and rode north through Outworld's Badlands with a fraction of the escort protocol demanded, because he had built an empire on the specific, stubborn principle that a general who let his own body dictate the terms of his ambition had already lost something more valuable than any single battle. He found Boros exactly where Kano's information had suggested he would be, not at the outcropping where the Black Dragon meeting had taken place, but a full day's travel further north, standing at the mouth of a narrow canyon that cut deep into the mountain range Kano's hand-drawn map had marked as the most promising of the 3 suspected shrine locations. Boros stood motionless at the canyon's entrance, head tilted slightly, the particular stillness of a hunter listening for something beneath the ordinary sounds of wind and rock. You are supposed to be recovering, Boros said, without turning, the moment Shao's warbeast crested the ridge above the canyon. I broke considerably more of you than a week accounts for. I heal on my own schedule, creature, not the one your fists set for me. Shao dismounted, and though the stiffness in his movement betrayed injuries not fully mended, his voice carried none of the strain his body clearly still felt. I did not come for a rematch, not yet. I came because word reached my administration that you have been asking questions about the old shrine sites in this range, and I decided I would rather hear your intentions directly than through the mangled version that reaches me by the time it passes through 3 intermediaries. Boros finally turned to face him, and something in his expression, genuine, unguarded interest, the particular attentiveness he'd extended to few beings since his arrival, suggested the directness pleased him. You are remarkably well informed for a man who has spent the last week confined to a healing chamber. I did not build an empire by allowing injury to blind me to what happens beyond my own walls. Shao crossed his arms, wincing faintly at the motion, though he made no attempt to hide it. You believe one of these 3 sites may lead you closer to the thing you're hunting. I want to know why you believe that, and I want to know what you intend to do to whatever, or whoever, guards it, before I decide whether Outworld's territory is going to become the staging ground for whatever comes next. Boros considered him for a long moment, weighing the request with the same careful attention he'd shown Kano's map. You could simply forbid me from entering, he observed. You are, by every account I have gathered, the sovereign authority over this territory. You could raise your entire army against me here, in this canyon, and force the confrontation you offered before your ribs interrupted it. I could. Shao's expression did not waver. And you would likely walk through my army the same way you walked through my scouts, and I would have spent soldiers I cannot easily replace, achieving nothing but delaying you by a matter of hours. He stepped closer, close enough now that the ache in his healing ribs was visible in the careful way he held himself, and met Boros's gaze without flinching. I did not build an empire on wasting strength for the satisfaction of a gesture creature. I built it by knowing precisely when to spend force and when to spend something more valuable instead. And what is it you propose to spend instead? Myself, Shao said simply. I will accompany you into that canyon, not as your prisoner, and not as your servant, as a general who has decided that whatever waits at the heart of these old shrines is going to affect my empire, whether I stand beside you or 100 miles away, pretending it does not concern me. I would rather see with my own eyes what you find than learn of it second-hand, filtered through the golden diplomacy of Liu Kang's council or the self-interested whispers of whatever vermin have already started circling you for profit. Something in Boros's expression shifted, the particular recalibration of a being encountering, for the second time since his arrival, an offer built on genuine, unvarnished pragmatism rather than fear or flattery. You surprise me, General, he said. I expected, when I saw you approach, either another attempt at the rematch or a formal demand that I leave your territory. I did not expect an offer of company. Then you have misjudged me as thoroughly as most who meet me for the first time, Shao said, and something almost like dark humor touched the corner of his mouth. I did not survive Outworld's throne through predictability, creature. Well, do we walk this canyon together? Or do I turn my war beast around and let you find out alone what guards a place old enough to have forgotten every ruler who has claimed sovereignty over the ground above it? Boros studied him a moment longer, and then, slowly, deliberately, extended one massive, taloned hand, not a threat, but an offer, the particular gesture of an equal, acknowledging an equal. Walk with me then, General, he said. I find I would rather have a witness who has already proven he does not break easily. The canyon deepened as they descended, the walls rising higher and closer with every 100 yards, the light growing dimmer and stranger, filtered through some quality in the air Shao could not name but recognized, with the particular unease of a man who had spent decades learning to trust his instincts as fundamentally wrong. The wind here did not sound like wind. It carried, faintly, at the edge of hearing, something closer to a held breath, patient and enormous. The same quality Boros had described feeling since the moment of his arrival. And Shao, walking beside him now, felt it too, for the first time, a cold weight settling low in his stomach that no amount of battlefield experience had prepared him for. "You feel it now," Boros said quietly, not a question. "I feel something," Shao admitted, and the admission cost him visibly, a general unaccustomed to acknowledging fear in any form. "I do not have your senses, creature. I do not know if what I feel is the thing you're hunting, or merely the natural unease of a place that has clearly not welcomed a visitor in longer than either of our lifetimes account for." "Both likely," Boros said. "This place has been touched by what lies beneath these realms. Not directly. I do not believe the one being has ever stirred enough to leave a mark this deliberate, but by whatever force first shaped this world around its stillness. A residue, an echo." He slowed his pace, studying the canyon walls with sharpened attention, and Shao, following his gaze, saw for the first time what had drawn it. Faint markings carved into the rock, worn nearly smooth by time, but unmistakably deliberate. Spiraling patterns that bore no resemblance to any script Shao's considerable knowledge of Outworld's ancient history could identify. They found the shrine itself another hour deeper into the canyon's twisting path. Not a temple, not a structure in any conventional sense, but a wide, circular clearing where the canyon opened briefly into a hollow bowl of stone, at the center of which stood a single, weathered pillar, unmarked by any inscription, radiating a stillness so profound it made the surrounding silence feel, by comparison, almost noisy. And standing before it, arranged in a loose defensive formation that suggested they had heard the approach long before Boros and Shao ever entered the clearing, waited a small cluster of figures Shao recognized immediately, with a sinking, complicated dread. Not soldiers, not sorcerers, but a handful of Edenian exiles, robed in the faded, careful garments of a people who had spent generations in hiding since Kotal Khan's era's political upheavals. Their leader, an elderly woman whose bearing carried the unmistakable dignity of someone who had once held genuine authority, before circumstance stripped it from her. "General Shao," the elderly woman said, and her voice, though thin with age, carried steady across the clearing. "I confess I did not expect Outworld's sovereign to walk this canyon personally. I expected eventually soldiers, or worse." Her eyes shifted to Boros, taking in his full, imposing height with a calm that impressed even him. "And I did not expect you at all, stranger, though word of your arrival has reached even those of us who have spent decades deliberately staying beyond the reach of every faction's notice. You are the shrine's guardians," Boros said, and it was not a question. "We are what remains of a duty passed down through generations of Edenian exile," the woman said. "Long before Kotal Khan, long before Shao Kahn's conquest of our homeland, our order was tasked with watching over places like this one, old wounds in the world's fabric, places where the boundary to what came before the realms grows thin. We do not worship what sleeps beneath this pillar. We do not serve it. We simply ensure that nothing disturbs it carelessly, and warn away those who would." "And if I do not intend to be warned away?" Boros asked, though his voice carried none of the predatory edge he'd shown the border scouts on his first day. "Something closer," Shao noted with genuine surprise, "to careful, deliberate respect." The old woman studied him for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened, not with fear, but with something closer to weary, ancient understanding. "Then I would ask you, stranger, before you touch that pillar, to understand exactly what you are risking, not for yourself, whose fate is your own to choose, but for everyone standing within 100 miles of wherever the consequences land. This shrine is not a door to the one being. It is a listening post, one of only 3 remaining in these realms where the echo of its presence can be heard clearly enough to be studied, rather than merely felt. Touch the pillar with intent to provoke what lies beyond it, and you risk not opening a door, but ringing a bell loud enough that something which has not stirred in longer than any recorded history might finally notice being watched. She paused, and her next words carried the full weight of generations of careful, guarded duty. We do not know what happens if it notices, stranger. No one in the history of this order has ever been foolish enough to test it. I am asking you now, with everything I have left to offer, do not be the first. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy across the clearing, Shao watching Boros's expression with the careful attention of a man who had, over the course of a single canyon's walk, come to genuinely respect the being beside him, and now found himself uncertain, for the first time, which way that respect would tip. "You are afraid," Boros said finally, quietly, studying the old woman with an expression that held none of the dismissiveness he might have shown a week earlier. "Not for yourselves, for everyone. I have spent my entire life afraid for everyone, stranger," the old woman said simply. "It is, I have found, the only honest way to carry a duty like this one." Boros was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something almost gentle, the same quality he'd shown briefly in his private admission to Kano days earlier. "I did not come to this world to destroy it," he said. "I came because I felt, for the first time since a war god ended my last fight with a single motion, something worth crossing an unimaginable distance to find. I do not know what I will do when I finally stand before it. I have not yet decided if I intend to fight it, or simply to see it, or something else entirely that I do not yet have words for." He looked past her, to the weathered pillar at the clearing center, and something in his expression carried, for the first time, genuine uncertainty rather than pure, hungry conviction. "But I will not lie to you and promise restraint I am not certain I can offer, when the moment finally comes." The old woman held his gaze for a long, searching moment, and then, unexpectedly, inclined her head, not surrender, but something closer to a measured, careful acceptance. "Then, I will not stand in your way today, stranger," she said, "because I do not believe I could, even if I chose to try, and because something in the way you speak of this, with doubt rather than certainty, gives me more hope than General Shao's rigid discipline or the fire god's careful diplomacy have managed to offer since word of you first reached us." She stepped aside from the pillar, her small cluster of guardians following her lead with visible reluctance. "But I ask one thing in return, before you touch it. Listen to what the echo actually tells you, rather than only what you came here hoping to hear. This place has waited a very long time for someone willing to actually listen, instead of simply demanding." Boros approached the pillar slowly, Shao watching with held breath, the old woman's warning still hanging heavy in the thin, strange air of the clearing. He raised one massive hand, hesitated for just a moment, the first hesitation Shao had witnessed from him since their first violent meeting, and pressed his palm flat against the weathered stone. The clearing did not explode into violence. It did not tear open into another realm. Instead, for a long, suspended moment, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The faint, ever-present pull Boros had felt since his arrival, sharpening suddenly into something almost like a voice. Not words, not language any of them could have translated, but a vast, wordless impression pressing directly into the mind of anyone standing close enough to receive it. Patient, it seemed to say, in a way none of them could have properly described afterward. Old, waiting, not for you, not yet. And then, as quickly as it had come, the impression faded. The air settled, and Boros stood before the pillar, hands still pressed to weathered stone, breathing hard, an expression on his face that Shao, watching from a careful distance, his own heart hammering with something he refused to name as fear, had never once seen him wear before, something that looked, unmistakably, like doubt. Boros did not speak for a long while after the pillar's voice faded, and General Shao, standing beside him in the clearing's thinning strange light, found himself, for the first time since they'd entered the canyon together, entirely uncertain what to say to a being he had begun, against every hardened instinct built across decades of rule, to genuinely respect. It was the old Edenian woman who finally broke the silence, her voice gentle in the way of someone who had spent a lifetime watching others confront things too large to carry alone. "You heard it," she said, "not merely felt it. That has not happened in this order's recorded history, not with such clarity, not on a first approach." "I heard it," Boros confirmed, and his voice, when it came, carried none of the confident hunger that had defined every word he'd spoken since his arrival. "It called me." He paused, searching for a translation his own language had never needed to develop. "Not yet. Not for you. As though I were early to an appointment I did not know I had made." He lowered his hand slowly from the pillar's weathered surface, and Shao noted, with quiet, private alarm, that the crystalline heart beneath his cracked armor, which had blazed gold-white through every prior exchange, had dimmed now to something closer to a low, uncertain flicker. "I have spent my entire existence, General, being told by everything that stood in my path that I was too much, too strong, too violent, too vast an appetite for whatever world I happen to be standing in. This is the first time anything has ever suggested, instead, that I might be too small." Shao said nothing for a long moment, weighing his words with the same careful deliberation he brought to any battlefield decision that mattered. "Perhaps," he said finally, "that is not an insult, creature. Perhaps it is simply true, and the honest question is not whether you are large enough, but whether you are prepared for what happens once you are." Boros turned to look at him, and something in his expression, raw, unguarded, entirely without the predatory confidence that had carried him through every prior encounter, suggested the observation had landed somewhere genuine. "You speak as though becoming prepared were a simple matter of will," he said. "I do not know how one prepares for something that predates every structure your realms have ever built to measure power. I do not know if such preparation is even possible." "Then perhaps," the old Edenian woman offered quietly, stepping closer now that the immediate tension of the shrine's response had passed, "that is the question worth spending your remaining patience on, stranger, rather than the question of when you finally provoke it. This order has watched this pillar for longer than any single life can properly account for, and in all that time, we have learned exactly one true thing about what sleeps beneath these realms." She met his eyes, steady despite her age, despite the weight of what she was about to say. "It does not measure worth by strength. If it did, the elder gods themselves, who by every account emerged from its own substance, would already have provoked whatever response you are hunting, long before your arrival ever crossed the folds between universes. It measures something else, something none of us, in all our generations of watching, have ever managed to name." Boros was quiet for a long time, studying the pillar, studying the strange, thin light of the clearing, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had regained some of its earlier weight, though the certainty beneath it had, unmistakably, cracked. "Then I will need to learn what that something is," he said, "before I return to this place with intent to provoke rather than merely to listen." He turned to Shao, and something in the gesture, deliberate, weighted, suggested a decision quietly forming. "I believe, General, that I owe your fire god the honest account of what I have just heard. I have kept my search largely to myself since our first meeting. I no longer believe that serves me." Liu Kang received the account 3 days later, delivered not by messenger but by Boros himself, standing once more in the amber chamber where their first conversation had taken place, General Shao at his side, an alliance of convenience that had, in the space of a single canyon walk, become something neither of them had fully articulated yet, even to themselves. "You heard its voice," Liu Kang said slowly, when the account had finished. and something in his expression carried a complicated mixture of relief and deepened concern that Boros had learned, over the past weeks, to read with increasing precision. In all the histories I have studied, all the fragments passed down from elder gods who themselves inherited half-understood knowledge from beings older than their own creation, I have never once encountered a record of the one being's presence, speaking so directly to anyone. Then perhaps that should trouble you more than it comforts you, fire god, Boros said. I do not believe it spoke to me out of welcome. I believe it spoke because something in my crossing, the door Quan Chi tore open, the fold that pulled me from my own dying universe into this one, registered on a scale that ordinary conflict within your realms has never approached. It called me early to an appointment I did not know I had made. That is not the language of something indifferent to my arrival, fire god. That is the language of something that has already, in some fashion, begun paying attention. Raiden, standing at Liu Kang's side, had gone very still, the particular stillness he wore when a threat had shifted, in a single conversation, from theoretical to genuinely, immediately present. If it is already aware of him, he said quietly, then the question is no longer whether he provokes a response by seeking it out deliberately. The question is what happens when it decides, on its own timeline, that the appointment it mentioned has finally arrived. That is precisely the fear that has kept me from returning to that canyon since, Boros admitted. And the admission, open, unguarded, entirely without the pride that had defined his first days in these realms, seemed to cost him something visible. I have spent my entire existence pursuing strength, as an answer to every obstacle placed before me. For the first time, I find myself uncertain that strength is the correct answer to this one, and a conqueror who no longer trusts his own answers, fire god, is a considerably more dangerous thing to have wandering your realms than one who is simply hungry. The chamber fell into a long, weighted silence, each of them turning over the full implication of what had just been said. It was Cetrion, entering quietly from the chamber's far archway, who finally spoke, her ancient voice carrying the particular calm she brought to moments when everyone else in the room had run out of certainty. Then perhaps, she said, this is the moment where these realms stop treating your presence as a threat to be managed, or a mystery to be observed from a careful distance, and start treating it as what it has genuinely become, a shared problem, requiring a shared answer, from every faction currently pretending they can afford to watch from the sidelines. She looked to Liu Kang. Call a council, fire god, not a war council, not a negotiation to buy more time, a genuine gathering of every power in these realms who has a stake in what happens next. Earth realm, Outworld, the Lin Kuei, even I suspect voices from the Nether realm who would rather speak honestly than continue circling this situation from the shadows, waiting to profit from whatever chaos it eventually produces. Her eyes moved to Boros, steady and searching. And let this creature stand in that council, not as a prisoner awaiting judgment, and not as an unmeasured threat awaiting containment, but as precisely what he has proven himself to be across these past weeks, a being capable of genuine doubt, genuine restraint, and genuine partnership, when these realms are honest enough to offer it to him in return. Word of the proposed council reached Havik's chamber within hours, carried this time not by a Black Dragon informant, but by one of his own cult's careful infiltrators, embedded for months within the lower ranks of Special Forces communications, precisely for moments like this one. Havik listened to the report with none of his earlier manic delight, his loose-jointed posture going, for once, genuinely still. A council, he repeated slowly. Every faction gathered in one chamber, treating this magnificent, unraveling chaos as something to be negotiated rather than harvested. His grill-covered jaw worked in something that might, on a less unnerving face, have passed for genuine frustration. Liu Kang always finds a way to sand the edges off catastrophe. Order's oldest, most tiresome trick, Invite the chaos to the table, offer it a seat, and watch it slowly, patiently, become just one more voice in the tedious machinery of consensus. Deceiver, one of his acolytes ventured carefully. If the creature is genuinely brought into alliance with the Fire God's Council, our position weakens considerably. We had counted on his search remaining solitary, unpredictable, ungoverned by any structure we would need to account for. I am aware of exactly what we counted on, Havik snapped, and for a moment, something genuinely dangerous flickered behind the calm mania he usually wore like armor. Then, slowly, the sharp, unsettling grin returned, and with it, the particular relish of a mind already 3 moves ahead of the problem it had just been handed. But perhaps, he said, we have simply been thinking too small about how to intervene. If Liu Kang intends to gather every faction into one room to discuss this creature's future, then perhaps the most delicious opportunity is not to keep him isolated from that council. He began pacing again, robes trailing ash, mind visibly racing. Perhaps it is to be in the room when it happens, to offer the one voice in that gathering that will tell this creature the truth. None of the others are brave enough to speak aloud. That order itself, the very structure he is being politely, patiently folded into, is the thing standing between him and the fight he actually crossed universes to find. His grin sharpened into something genuinely hungry. Send word requesting the cult of the Deceiver's presence at this council, in the spirit of full and honest representation of every faction with a stake in the outcome. Let us see how patient Liu Kang's precious consensus remains, once chaos itself has been handed a seat at the table. The council convened 5 days later, in a vast, open-air amphitheater, carved into the base of Outworld's northern mountains, neutral ground by ancient tradition, used for exactly this kind of gathering, since long before Shao Kahn's conquest had reshaped the realm's political landscape. Representatives filed in through the morning haze, Liu Kang and Raiden and Kung Lao, carrying Earthrealm's careful diplomacy, General Shao, still moving with the stiff care of ribs not fully healed, flanked by a modest honor guard, rather than the full military escort his position technically permitted, Sub-Zero, representing the Lin Kuei's cautious, watchful neutrality, Sonya Blade, arriving late and visibly displeased at having been talked into attending a gathering she still, privately, considered premature, and, to a ripple of open unease across the amphitheater, Havik himself, arriving unannounced, but technically, infuriatingly, within his rights, as a faction leader with genuine stake in the outcome. Boros stood at the amphitheater's center, alone, facing the assembled powers of 6 realms with a bearing that had changed, subtly but unmistakably, since his first violent day in these lands. Less the confident, hungry conqueror who had dismantled 6 border scouts without breaking stride, more something that had, against every instinct built across a lifetime of conquest, learned to sit with genuine uncertainty. I did not come to these realms seeking allies, he said, when Liu Kang had finished the council's opening formalities, and the assembled powers had settled into a wary, watchful silence. I came seeking an ending. One final, worthy fight, to close a life, spent finding every other fight disappointing. I have found, instead, something considerably more complicated. A world with genuine substance in it. Warriors who earned my respect rather than simply my contempt. His eyes moved briefly to Shao, then to Liu Kang, before returning to the assembled council as a whole. And a presence beneath all of it that has, in the space of a single conversation lasting less than a heartbeat, made me doubt, for the first time in my existence, whether strength alone has ever been the correct answer to anything I have wanted. The silence that followed was heavy, weighted with the particular gravity of powerful beings, recalibrating their assumptions in real time. It was Havik, predictably, who broke it first. his voice carrying across the amphitheater with the particular relish of a man who had been waiting, patiently, for exactly this opening. "How touching," he said, stepping forward from the gathered factions, spreading his arms wide in a gesture that took in the entire assembled council. "The conqueror, humbled. The chaos, tamed. Shall we all applaud Liu Kang's remarkable talent for turning even the most magnificent disruption into one more polite voice at his negotiating table?" His grill-covered face turned toward Boros directly, and something in his posture shifted, unnervingly earnest, despite the mania threading through every word. "Or shall someone in this gathering finally tell you the truth? These good, orderly people are far too invested in their comfortable structures to speak aloud. You did not cross the folds between universes to find doubt, stranger. You crossed them to find an ending. And every voice in this amphitheater, every single one, myself excluded, is here today for exactly one purpose: to convince you, gently, patiently, with all the practiced diplomacy Liu Kang's council has spent years perfecting, to set that ending aside, and become instead one more piece in the tedious, endless machinery of order they have all sworn their lives to maintaining." The amphitheater held its breath, and Liu Kang, watching Boros's expression with the careful attention of a man who understood exactly how much weight Havik's words carried, felt the fragile structure of the council's purpose teeter on a knife's edge. "You mistake my intentions, deceiver," he said, stepping forward before the silence could stretch a moment longer. "I did not gather this council to convince Boros to abandon his search. I gathered it because I believe these realms owe him something they have not yet offered, an honest reckoning with what that search will cost, from every voice who has a stake in the outcome, rather than the comfortable half-truths any single faction might be tempted to offer alone." His eyes moved to Boros directly. "You are not a piece to be folded into anyone's machinery. You are a being who has shown, across these past weeks, more genuine capacity for growth than most of the powers gathered in this amphitheater manage across entire lifetimes. I did not call this council to tame you. I called it because I believe you deserve better than to make the largest decision of your existence alone, misinformed or manipulated by whichever faction reaches you first with the most convenient version of the truth." "Convenient," Havik repeated, and something in his loose-jointed posture sharpened, delight giving way, briefly, to something closer to genuine conviction. "Is that what you call it, Fire God? I have watched you and your predecessor Raiden spend generations insisting that order is simply the natural, correct shape of these realms, that chaos is a disease to be managed rather than a truth to be reckoned with. You call my presence here manipulation. I call it the first honest voice this creature has heard since he arrived, because I, unlike every other soul in this amphitheater, am not asking him to become smaller, more careful, more patient, more convenient for the rest of us to live alongside." He turned back to Boros, and his voice, for once, dropped the manic edge entirely, replaced by something almost gentle, almost sincere, which made it, Liu Kang thought grimly, considerably more dangerous than his usual theatrics. "You felt doubt at that pillar, stranger, and every voice in this gathering wants you to treat that doubt as wisdom. I would ask you instead, what if it was simply fear, dressed up in wisdom's clothing, because something ancient and comfortable in its stillness does not actually want to be disturbed, and told you exactly what it needed to tell you to ensure you walked away?" The question landed with real weight, and Liu Kang watched, with quiet alarm, something in Boros's expression flicker. Not conviction, not yet, but the particular unsettled consideration of a being encountering a possibility he had not, in his days of genuine doubt, allowed himself to fully entertain. It was General Shao, unexpectedly, who spoke next, his voice carrying the particular flat authority of a man who had spent decades learning to distrust anyone whose arguments served their own interest too neatly. "I have fought beside this creature exactly once, and walked beside him through a canyon that unsettled even my own considerable nerve, he said, stepping forward to stand at Boros's side, a gesture that drew visible surprise across the assembled council, an alliance neither man had announced but which had, apparently, become simply true in the days since their shared journey. I do not know what waits beneath these realms any better than the rest of you gathered here, but I know this, deceiver, because I have built and held an empire on knowing precisely which counsel serves the counselor, rather than the one receiving it. He turned his gaze on Havik directly, unflinching. You do not stand here today offering this creature honesty. You stand here offering him exactly what serves your own appetite for chaos, encouragement toward the single most catastrophic outcome these realms could suffer, dressed up as liberation from the rest of us supposedly caging him. His hand rested, deliberate, on the haft of the warhammer at his back. I have crushed skulls for less transparent manipulation than what you have just offered, deceiver, and I find myself sorely tempted to make an exception to this gathering's neutral ground. General, Liu Kang said, a note of caution in his voice, though he made no move to actually stop him. I am not finished, Fire God. Shao did not look away from Havik. But I will grant the deceiver this much, because even I am not so blind as to dismiss every uncomfortable truth simply because the mouth delivering it is untrustworthy. He is correct that we, all of us gathered here, myself included, have a stake in this creature choosing caution. That is not something to be ashamed of concealing. It is something to be honest about, so that when he weighs our counsel, he weighs it with full knowledge of exactly what each of us stands to gain or lose from whichever path he chooses. He turned to Boros directly. I do not tell you to abandon your search because I fear what happens to Outworld if you succeed, though I confess that fear sits in me plainly enough. I tell you because I have come, across these past weeks, to genuinely respect you as something more than a weapon or a threat, and I would rather see you live long enough to become whatever you are still capable of becoming than watch you spend yourself chasing an ending that predates every structure either of us understands. Boros was silent for a long moment. The weight of the amphitheater's attention settled fully on him now. Every faction's argument laid bare in a way that left him, for the first time since his arrival, genuinely uncertain which voice deserved his trust. You have all, he said finally, slowly, given me reasons to doubt. The fire god's caution, the general's hard-won respect, the deceiver's uncomfortable, self-serving honesty. He looked around the amphitheater, at the assembled powers of 6 realms, each watching him with their own complicated mixture of hope and calculation. None of you has given me an answer, and I begin to suspect, standing here, that perhaps no one in these realms actually possesses one, that the true shape of what I am hunting has remained hidden for so long, precisely because no one who has ever come close enough to understand it has survived long enough, or been brave enough, to bring that understanding back. Then perhaps, said a new voice, quiet but carrying easily across the amphitheater's stone acoustics, it is time someone tried. Every head turned. Cetrion had risen from her seat among the gathered council, and something in her ancient bearing, the particular stillness of a being who rarely spoke unless the moment genuinely demanded it, silenced the amphitheater more completely than any authority Liu Kang or Shao had managed across the entire preceding exchange. I am the elder goddess of earth and life, she said, moving to stand at the amphitheater's center alongside Boros, her pale robes catching the morning light. I have existed since before the current shape of these realms was drawn, though I confess, even I do not possess the deep, first-hand knowledge of what came before the Elder God's own emergence. That knowledge, if it survives anywhere, exists only in fragments, scattered across ruins older than any living memory can properly account for. She turned to face Boros directly. But I know this much, with genuine certainty, rather than speculation dressed as wisdom. The one being stillness has held for longer than any recorded history, through wars that shattered timelines, through the Elder God's own internal conflicts, through Chronica's manipulation of the very flow of time itself. Nothing, stranger, in the entire recorded span of these realms' existence, has ever come close enough to disturb it before you. Her eyes, ancient and unblinking, held his without flinching. That alone should tell you something worth weighing more carefully than either the fire god's caution or the deceiver's provocation. You are not simply another test it has weathered. You are something genuinely, unprecedentedly new. And I do not believe, whatever the pillar's voice meant by not yet, that its message was fear, exactly as Havik suggests. Nor was it simple welcome, exactly as your own hope might prefer. I believe, if I am honest with you as you deserve, that none of us, not the elder gods, not the titans, not the oldest scholars in 6 realms, actually know what it was, and that uncertainty is the single most honest thing any of us can offer you today. The council did not resolve, that day, into a single unified answer. Liu Kang had not truly expected it to, though some quiet part of him had hoped for more clarity than the gathering ultimately produced. What it produced instead, in the hours of debate that followed Cetrion's honest admission, was something considerably more valuable and considerably more fragile, a fragmented, genuine understanding, across nearly every faction present, of exactly how much was actually unknown, and exactly how much rode on whatever choice Boros ultimately made. Havik left the amphitheater before the council's formal close. His earlier conviction curdled back into something closer to his familiar manic amusement, though something in his parting words to Boros, delivered quietly, almost gently as he passed, lingered with considerably more weight than his usual theatrical malice. "Think on this, stranger," he said, pausing just long enough to be heard clearly. "Every single voice in that amphitheater today spoke to you of caution, of doubt, of the terrible weight of consequence. Not one of them, not the fire god, not the general, not even the honest goddess who finally admitted her own ignorance, offered you the thing you actually crossed universes searching for. They offered you reasons to stop. I am the only one in this entire gathering who has ever, even once, asked you what you actually want, rather than what serves the rest of us for you to want instead." He tilted his grill-covered head, something almost sympathetic in the gesture despite everything monstrous underneath it. "When you finally tire of their patient, well-meaning caution, and you will, stranger, because I have watched enough beings like you across enough centuries to know exactly how long that patience lasts. You will know where to find someone who still remembers what you actually came here for." He vanished into the gathering crowd before Boros could answer, leaving behind a silence that felt, to everyone who'd witnessed the exchange, considerably heavier than it had any right to be. That evening, as the council's gathered factions dispersed back toward their own territories, and Boros remained alone atop the amphitheater's highest tier, watching the sun set over Outworld's jagged northern peaks, General Shao found him there, uninvited, but unsurprised to find himself welcome regardless. "You are weighing the deceiver's words," Shao said, settling beside him with the careful stiffness of ribs still not fully healed. "Do not deny it. I have seen that particular expression on the faces of soldiers who have just been offered a truth, uncomfortable enough to actually be worth considering." "I am weighing all of it," Boros admitted, watching the last light fade from the horizon. "The fire god's caution, your respect, the goddess's honesty, and yes, General, the deceiver's provocation. Uncomfortable as it is to admit that something so unhinged might have spoken the one truth none of the others were willing to voice plainly." He turned to look at Shao directly. "I did not cross an unimaginable distance for caution, General. I crossed it because a war god ended my existence with a single motion, and in the moment before that ending, I felt something I had not felt in longer than I care to measure. Genuine, unguarded joy at finally facing something that might actually be my equal. I have spent these past weeks in your realms discovering doubt, discovering respect, discovering, for the first time, hesitation. But I have not once, discovered anything that has actually replaced the hunger that brought me here in the first place. Shao was quiet for a long moment, watching the same fading light, weighing his next words with the particular care of a man who had, across these past weeks, come to genuinely value the strange, unlikely respect that had grown between them. Then perhaps, he said finally, the honest question is not whether you abandon that hunger, creature. I do not believe you could, even if every voice in these realms begged it of you. Perhaps the honest question is whether you are willing to become worthy of surviving what answering it might actually cost. Not through recklessness, the way you arrived, but through the same patience and precision you have shown me, unexpectedly, across every day since. He rose, wincing faintly at the motion, and looked down at Boros with an expression that carried for the first time something genuinely close to friendship. I will not tell you to stop searching, Boros. I have come to respect you too much to insult you, with counsel I do not believe you would accept, or should accept. But I will offer you this instead, freely, without the deceiver's self-interest tangled beneath it. When you are finally ready, truly ready, not merely hungry, I will stand beside you when you go. Not because Outworld demands it, and not because Liu Kang's counsel has asked it of me, because I have fought beside you exactly once, and found, for the first time in longer than I care to admit, something in these realms genuinely worth calling an equal. Boros looked up at him for a long, silent moment, something in his expression settling into a resolve that had not been fully present before. Not the hungry certainty of his first days in these realms, but something considerably more grounded, more earned. Then we walk to it together, General, he said. When the time is right. I find I would rather face whatever waits beneath these realms beside someone who has earned the right to stand there, than alone, chasing an ending I no longer fully understand. 3 weeks passed in something the amphitheater's council had not dared hope for. A genuine, if fragile, calm. Boros did not return to the canyon shrine. He did not resume his restless hunting of the realm's borders, testing every scout and soldier unfortunate enough to cross his path. Instead, in a development that unsettled Liu Kang's council almost as much as his earlier violence had, he settled, provisionally, watchfully, but unmistakably, into something resembling a routine, training alongside General Shao's most elite honor guard on the training grounds outside Shao's fortress, sparring with Kung Lao and Sub-Zero in careful, controlled exchanges that taught him more about the realm's particular grammar of combat than any amount of solitary hunting could have offered. It was during one such session, 3 weeks into the quiet, that Kung Lao, hook swords sheathed, breathing hard after an exchange that had left them both bruised but neither seriously hurt, asked the question that had clearly been building in him since the amphitheater council. You could have simply gone back, he said, dropping to sit on the training ground's low stone wall, watching Boros do the same. Ignored the whole council, ignored Shao's offer, ignored every careful, patient argument we've all made. You are stronger than any of us. Nothing in these realms could have actually stopped you if you'd decided your hunger mattered more than our objections. No, Boros agreed. Nothing could have. Then why didn't you? Boros considered the question for a long moment, watching the training ground's other combatants continue their own exchanges in the middle distance, and when he answered, his voice carried an honesty that had, in the space of 3 weeks, become considerably more natural to him than it had been on his first violent day in these realms. Because I have spent a great deal of my existence being the strongest thing in every room I entered, he said, and I have learned, across those weeks in your realms, that being the strongest thing in a room is not the same as being ready for what waits outside it. He rolled his shoulder, testing an old ache that had never quite faded since the shrine's voice first touched him. I do not fully trust the deceiver's suggestion that my doubt was merely fear dressed as wisdom, but I do not fully dismiss it either. And I have decided, for the first time in longer than I can measure, that the wiser course is to become genuinely certain of my own readiness before I test that theory against something that has outlasted every structure your realms have ever built. Kung Lao studied him for a moment, something like genuine respect settling into his expression. That's not the answer I expected from a conqueror. I am learning, Kung Lao, that perhaps I was never simply a conqueror to begin with, Boros said, and there was, for the first time, something almost wry in the observation, merely a being who had not yet found anything worth becoming more than that. The quiet did not extend to every corner of the realms, however much Liu Kang's council might have wished otherwise. Deep in the nether realm, in a sanctum carved from obsidian and old, patient malice, Havik had spent the same 3 weeks in considerably more focused activity than his usual theatrical provocations suggested to outside observers. He had withdrawn his cult's more visible agitators from the border territories, quieted the whispered rumors his acolytes had been spreading through Outworld's markets, and turned instead to something his closest followers understood, correctly, to be considerably more dangerous than mere mischief. "You are certain of the ritual's requirements?" he asked, pacing the length of a chamber lined with texts salvaged from the Netherrealm's oldest, most carefully guarded archives, records predating even Shinnok's reign, fragments of cosmology so old that most scholars in 6 realms had long since dismissed them as unreliable myth. "As certain as anything from sources this fragmentary allows, deceiver," said the acolyte responsible for the translation work, a gaunt, hollow-eyed cultist named Auric, who had spent the better part of a decade studying exactly the kind of forbidden text this task required. "The shrine sites, the 3 locations the Edenian Order has guarded for generations, are not merely listening posts as they claim. They are, if these fragments are accurate, resonance points, places where a sufficiently focused ritual could amplify a disturbance already present, rather than merely observing it." He hesitated, the particular hesitation of a man who understood exactly how dangerous the knowledge he carried actually was. "If we perform the ritual at the canyon shrine, the one the creature already touched, already disturbed once with his own presence, we would not be creating a new disturbance from nothing. We would be amplifying an echo that already exists, forcing the one being's attention toward that location with considerably more force than a single touch of the pillar ever achieved." "And the risk?" Havik asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer, and had already, privately, decided it did not matter to him. "Catastrophic, if the fragments are accurate," Auric admitted. "We would not be inviting a conversation, deceiver. We would be ringing the bell the old woman warned Boros against ringing, except deliberately, with considerably more force, and without his readiness or consent." He looked up from the ancient text, genuine fear breaking through his usual careful deference. "If it wakes fully, rather than merely acknowledging the disturbance as it apparently did with the creature's initial touch, we do not know what happens next. No fragment I have found offers even speculation on that scale." Havik was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped the manic theatricality entirely, replaced by something quieter, more genuinely, unnervingly sincere. "Do you understand what these realms have become, Auric, in the centuries since the elder gods first drew their careful, tidy borders across what was once genuine chaos?" he asked. "Tournaments, rules, sacred combat, bound by rituals so rigid that even war itself has been tamed into something orderly, predictable, safe. I have spent my entire existence trying to crack that structure, and I have failed, again and again, because every crack I managed to open, Liu Kang's patient diplomacy and Raiden's careful non-interference, eventually sand smooth again. He turned to face Auric directly, and something in his loose-jointed, unnerving stillness carried more genuine conviction than his usual chaos had ever managed. This creature, this magnificent, doubting, hesitating creature that Liu Kang's council has spent 3 weeks patiently talming into caution, is the single greatest opportunity chaos has had in this cosmology's entire recorded history. I will not watch him be gentled into another obedient piece of the same tired machinery. I will force the confrontation myself, if his own newfound patience refuses to. Deceiver, Auric began, real alarm coloring his voice now. If the fragments are even partially accurate, this could unmake everything, not merely disrupt the realm's balance, unmake them entirely. Yes, Havik agreed, and something in his grill-covered face, for just a moment, carried genuine, unguarded honesty, rather than his usual performance. That is rather the point, Auric. I have never once claimed to want a better version of the current order. I want to see what grows when there is no order left at all to constrain it. And I am no longer willing to wait patiently for a stranger's doubt to resolve itself in the direction I need it to. He straightened, decision visibly settling into place behind his unsettling eyes. Gather what remains of our cult's most devoted. We move within the week. If the creature will not choose to provoke his own ending, then chaos itself will choose it for him. Word of the cult's unusual quiet, the withdrawal of their usual agitators, the sudden focused activity within their deepest sanctums, reached the Lin Kuei's surveillance network within days, though its true purpose remained, for the moment, maddeningly opaque even to Sub-Zero's most careful analysis. Something has changed in their behavior, he reported to the gathered council. Liu Kang, General Shao, and, for the first time, Boros himself, invited now as a genuine participant, rather than merely the subject of the realm's careful deliberation. They have gone quiet in every visible metric, which for a cult built around chaos and provocation is considerably more alarming than their usual noise. Whatever Havik is planning, he is planning it carefully, and in secret, which is not a pattern this cult typically follows. You believe it concerns me, Boros said, and it was not a question. I believe it would be foolish to assume otherwise, Sub-Zero said. Havik made his interest in your search plain enough at the council. If he has concluded that patience, yours and ours, no longer serves his purposes, I would expect him to attempt forcing the confrontation himself, by whatever means his cult's forbidden knowledge makes available to him. Liu Kang's expression tightened, the particular controlled alarm of a leader confronting a threat that had, in a single report, shifted from theoretical to genuinely urgent. The Canyon Shrine, he said slowly. If he intends to force a disturbance rather than wait for one, that is the location with the most established resonance already present. Boros's own touch left an echo there that a sufficiently reckless ritual might amplify. Then we move now, Shao said, already rising, hand instinctively finding the haft of his warhammer. Whatever forbidden knowledge Havik's cult has gathered, we do not have the luxury of waiting to learn its full shape before he acts. Wait, Boros's voice, quiet but carrying real weight, stilled the room. Every eye turned to him, and something in his expression, genuine focused resolve, entirely different from the hungry certainty of his first days, suggested a decision already forming. If Havik intends to force this confrontation prematurely, through means none of us fully understand or control, then the danger is not merely to the guardians who protect that shrine, or to whatever cultists Havik has convinced to risk themselves for his vision of glorious unraveling. The danger is to everyone in these realms, if his ritual succeeds in provoking a response before I am genuinely ready to face what it summons. He rose, and something in the gesture carried the full weight of the choice settling into place. I told you all, 3 weeks ago, that I would rather become worthy of what I am hunting before I face it, rather than reckless. I do not believe I have had enough time to become that worthy, but I do not believe either that I have the luxury of continuing to wait, if Havik intends to force the confrontation regardless of my readiness. His yellow eyes swept the gathered council, settling last on Shao. You offered, General, to stand beside me when the time was right. I fear that time has just been chosen for us, rather than by us. I would still welcome you at my side, if that offer remains true. Shao's hand tightened on his warhammer, and something in his hardened expression carried, unmistakably, the weight of a promise he had no intention of breaking. It remains true, he said. Then let us move quickly, creature, before the deceiver's madness costs us the choice of when and how this confrontation finally happens. They moved within the hour, Boros and General Shao at the fore, Liu Kang and Raiden close behind, Kung Lao and Sub-Zero rallying what forces could be gathered on short notice. A strange, unprecedented column of Earthrealm, Outworld, and Lin Kuei strength marching together toward a canyon that had, until 3 weeks earlier, belonged to no one but a handful of aging Edenian guardians, and whatever ancient stillness slept beneath its central pillar. Sonya Blade, informed by relay as the column crossed into the Badlands, mobilized a special forces strike team of her own within the same hour, though the distance ensured they would arrive, at best, only slightly behind the main force. Tell Liu Kang I want eyes on this, the second we're in range, she snapped at her communications officer, already strapping into gear. And tell him if this deceiver's cult manages to actually wake something older than the elder gods themselves, I am formally revoking every ounce of patience I've extended toward his diplomatic approach to problem solving. The canyon, when the column finally reached its mouth 2 days later, Boros setting a pace that pushed even Shao's considerable endurance, driven by an urgency none of them needed to voice aloud, did not look, at first glance, as though anything had changed. The narrow walls rose the same as they had on Boros and Shao's first visit, the strange, thin light still filtering down with the same unsettling quality. But the wrongness in the air had sharpened, unmistakably, into something with weight and direction, a low, resonant hum beneath the canyon's usual silence that made even Raiden's storm-attuned senses prickle with alarm the moment they crossed the threshold. They are already at the shrine, Raiden said, staff crackling faintly with unspent lightning. I can feel the ritual structure forming. This is not amateur work, whatever Havik has assembled. There is real, focused power behind it. They found the clearing transformed. Where the weathered pillar had stood alone in quiet stillness 3 weeks earlier, it now stood at the center of a wide, carefully inscribed ritual circle. Dark runes burned directly into the stone floor of the hollow bowl, pulsing with a sickly violet-black light that matched nothing in the natural spectrum of Outworld's usual sorcery. Havik stood at the circle's edge, arms raised, his loose-jointed frame swaying with the particular rhythm of a man deep in the grip of a ritual already well underway, flanked by perhaps 30 of his most devoted cultists, chanting in a language that predated even the oldest Netherrealm texts Sub-Zero scholars had ever catalogued. And scattered across the clearing's edges, bound and gagged but unmistakably, horribly alive, lay the small cluster of elderly Edenian guardians who had, 3 weeks earlier, offered Boros the first genuine wisdom he'd encountered in these realms. Havik. Liu Kang's voice cracked across the clearing like a whip, cutting through the chant's rhythm for just a moment before the cultists resumed, undeterred. Stop this madness before you unmake everything you claim to want to see reborn from its ashes. Havik did not stop his ritual gestures, but he turned his grill-covered face toward the newly arrived column, and something in his expression, genuine, unhinged delight, suggested he had, in fact, been expecting exactly this response. Fire God. he called back, voice carrying the particular manic joy of a man watching his careful planning finally bear fruit. How wonderful of you all to arrive precisely as the ritual reaches its most delicate stage. I confess I had hoped for an audience, but I did not expect quite such a distinguished one. He gestured, sweeping one arm toward the bound guardians. Your careful old friends attempted to stop me 3 days ago, when my devoted first arrived to prepare the circle. I am afraid their centuries of patient guardianship proved rather less effective against genuine commitment than against a single hesitant stranger asking politely for permission. Release them, Boros said, and his voice carried a quality none of them had heard from him since his earliest, most violent days in these realms. Cold, absolute, entirely without the doubt and restraint he had spent 3 weeks carefully cultivating. Oh, I fully intend to, Havik said, and something in his tone made the promise considerably more unsettling than a simple refusal would have been. The moment the ritual concludes, stranger, they will be released into a world that may look considerably different than the one they knew, but released nonetheless. I am, whatever else you believe of me, a being of my word when it costs me nothing to keep it. He returned his attention to the ritual circle, and the pitch of the chant around him began, unmistakably, to build. You have 3 weeks of careful, patient doubt behind you, stranger, and I respect that journey, genuinely, more than you likely believe. But I no longer have patience for waiting on your readiness. The echo you left on that pillar has been building for weeks now, resonating through every stone in this canyon, and my ritual is not creating anything new. It is simply amplifying what was already, unmistakably, there. In moments, that resonance will reach a threshold no amount of careful diplomacy or patient restraint will be able to undo. Shao was already moving, warhammer drawn, cutting through the outer ring of cultists with brutal, efficient force, and the clearing erupted into sudden, chaotic violence. Sub-Zero's ice constructs freezing a wave of cultists mid-charge, Kung Lao's hook swords finding openings with lethal precision, Raiden's lightning arcing between attackers with controlled, devastating accuracy. But Havik's devoted, 30 strong and genuinely willing to die for their master's vision, fought with a desperate, fanatical intensity that slowed the column's advance toward the ritual circle's center far more than their numbers alone should have accounted for. Boros did not join the general melee. He moved instead, directly, ruthlessly, toward Havik himself, cutting through cultists in his path with a speed and force that left no ambiguity about his intentions. Not restraint, this time. Not the careful measure he'd shown General Shao's soldiers weeks earlier, but genuine, focused urgency. Havik, watching him close the distance, only laughed, and did not break his ritual stance. You cannot stop it by killing me, stranger, he called, voice rising over the growing chaos of battle around them, the violet-black light of the runes beneath him pulsing brighter, faster, building toward something none of them could properly name. The ritual does not require my continued life to complete, only my initial casting, which finished the moment your General Shao's hammer first cracked one of my devoted skulls. I am not the key that stops this door from opening, stranger. I never was. I am simply the one honest enough to admit I wanted it opened. Boros reached him a heartbeat later, one massive hand closing around Havik's throat with enough force to crush stone, and lifted him bodily from the ritual circle's center. But the runes beneath them did not dim, did not falter, the pulsing violet-black light building instead toward a crescendo that made the very air in the clearing begin to shudder, the strange thin light of the canyon's usual atmosphere warping and distorting around the pillar's base. Then you have doomed everyone in this canyon, Boros said, voice dropping to something cold and final, for the sake of watching what grows in the ashes. No, Havik gasped, even as Boros's grip tightened around his throat. and something in his choked, strangled voice carried, unmistakably, genuine, unrepentant conviction, rather than fear. "I have given you exactly what you needed, stranger, whether you thank me for it or curse me. You spent 3 weeks waiting to become ready. I have just ensured you no longer have the luxury of that patience. Whatever waits beneath that pillar is coming, now, whether you are prepared or not. And I would wager, when it finally arrives, you will discover that no amount of careful, patient waiting could have ever truly prepared you regardless." The pillar at the clearing's center began, for the first time in any recorded history the Edenian Guardian's Order had ever documented, to crack. The sound that followed was not an explosion, and it was not thunder, and it was not any noise the assembled fighters, Boros, Shao, Liu Kang, Raiden, Kung Lao, Sub-Zero, even Havik's own remaining devoted, their chant faltering now into genuine, unguarded terror, had ever encountered in their considerable, varied experience of violence and cataclysm. It was, instead, a silence so total, so absolute, that every other sound in the clearing simply ceased to exist within it, swallowed whole the instant the pillar's ancient stone split cleanly down its center. Light poured from the crack, but it was not light in any sense the eye could properly process. Not gold, not white, not any color that belonged to the visible spectrum, but something that registered instead as an absence given shape, a wound in the fabric of the clearing itself, through which something vast and old and patient, finally, after all its long, unmeasured stillness, began, unmistakably, to look through. Boros released Havik, who collapsed to the ritual circle's shattered stone floor, and turned, slowly, to face the widening crack in the pillar, every instinct built across a lifetime of conquest suddenly, entirely irrelevant to what stood before him. "Boros." Liu Kang's voice came from somewhere behind him, tight with an alarm the fire god had not allowed himself to show since the very first tremor of Boros's arrival weeks earlier. "Whatever this is, whatever is happening, this is not the confrontation any of us intended. This is Havik's madness forcing a door open before any of us were ready to walk through it." "I know," Boros said, and his voice, for the first time since his arrival in these realms, carried something that was not hunger, was not doubt, was not even fear exactly, but something considerably stranger, the particular, suspended calm of a being finally standing at the threshold of the single thing he had crossed an unimaginable distance to find, and discovering, in the actual moment of arrival, that every certainty he had carried into that crossing had simply, quietly, dissolved. The crack widened further, and the silence deepened, and from within it, a figure began, slowly, patiently, without hurry, without malice, without anything that resembled either welcome or threat, to step through. It was not, in any sense the assembled fighters could properly process, a monster. The figure that stepped through the widening crack in the pillar stood perhaps 12 feet tall, humanoid in the roughest possible sense, 2 arms, 2 legs, a suggestion of a head, but rendered not in flesh or armor or any material substance the eye could categorize, but in something that read, simultaneously, as absolute darkness and as light given form, its surface a rippling black shot through, with fine branching cracks of radiant gold, like a night sky glimpsed through shattered obsidian. It made no sound as it emerged. It cast no shadow, because it was, in some fundamental sense none of them could articulate, already more shadow than anything capable of casting one. And where its presence touched the clearing's air, the ordinary rules governing sound and light, and even, faintly, gravity itself seemed to bend, very slightly, around its stillness, the way water bends around a stone dropped into a still pond, except the stone here was so vast that the entire pond had reoriented itself to accommodate its presence. Havik, still sprawled on the shattered ritual circle where Boros had dropped him, stared up at the emerging figure with an expression that had, for the first time since any of them had known him, entirely abandoned its manic delight, replaced instead by something closer to genuine, primal awe. "Oh," he said, very quietly, the word barely audible even in the profound silence the figure's presence had imposed on the clearing. "Oh, it's beautiful." The one being did not respond to him. It did not appear, in fact, to register his presence at all, or the presence of the scattered, terrified cultists, or the bound Edenian guardians, or Sub-Zero's ice constructs still frozen mid-thaw at the clearing's edges, or Raiden's crackling, unspent lightning, or Kung Lao's hook swords, still drawn but suddenly, unmistakably, feeling very small in his hands. Its attention, if attention was even the correct word for whatever process was occurring behind that rippling, cracked darkness, moved instead, slowly, deliberately, unmistakably, to settle on Boros, and only Boros, standing alone at the center of the clearing where he had released Havik's throat moments before. "You came early," a voice said, and it was not a voice in any sense that used sound, but an impression pressed directly into the mind of every being in the clearing, the same wordless, vast pressure the pillar had briefly conveyed weeks earlier, now sustained, continuous, and directed with unmistakable, singular focus. "I told you. Not yet. Not for you. I did not choose this timing," Boros said, and his voice, spoken aloud into the clearing's profound silence, sounded suddenly, jarringly small against the scale of what stood before him, though he did not flinch from it, did not step back, held his ground with the same stubborn, hard-won discipline he had spent 3 weeks cultivating. "A being behind me forced this door open before either of us was ready. I did not come here today to provoke you. I came to stop him. I know," the presence said, and something in the wordless impression carried, unmistakably, a quality that might, in a being capable of ordinary expression, have passed for something close to patience, or perhaps, more unsettlingly, something close to amusement. "I have watched you since the moment the sorcerer's door first pulled you through the fold. I have watched your doubt. I have watched your restraint. I have watched you learn, in a handful of weeks, things that took the beings who eventually became my scattered fragments considerably longer to understand." The rippling darkness shifted, very slightly, in a motion that might have been the beginning of a gesture, or might simply have been the fabric of its being settling into a new configuration. "You did not come here ready, but you came here honest. That is, I find, considerably rarer among the beings who have eventually stood where you now stand." Liu Kang, watching from the clearing's edge, felt something cold settle low in his chest. Not fear exactly, but the particular vertigo of a being who had spent his entire existence believing he understood, at least in broad outline, the shape of the cosmology he protected, now confronted with the genuine, unmistakable evidence that he had understood almost nothing at all. "You have watched him since his arrival," Liu Kang said, stepping forward despite every instinct urging caution, driven by a need to understand that outweighed, in this singular moment, even his considerable self-preservation. "Then you have watched all of us. You have watched these realms this entire time in silence, without ever once intervening." The presence finished, and its attention shifted, for the first time, away from Boros, settling instead on Liu Kang, with a weight that made the fire god's considerable, hard-won composure waver, despite his every effort to hold it steady. "Yes, fire god, I have watched the elder gods you serve rise from fragments of what I once was, whole. I have watched them build the careful architecture of realms and rules and rituals of combat that you have spent your own considerable existence defending and rebuilding. I have watched wars and reconciliations and the slow, patient turning of timelines you yourself once helped reshape. Something in the wordless impression carried, unmistakably, a note of genuine, ancient weariness. I have watched all of it, Fire God, because watching, without intervening, is the only shape my existence has taken since the day I tore myself apart to make room for something other than my own singular, suffocating wholeness. The clearing had gone utterly silent now, even Havik's remaining cultists, too stunned by the sheer scale of what they were witnessing to, so much as whisper among themselves. Why? The question came, unexpectedly, from General Shao, who had lowered his warhammer without quite realizing he'd done so, staring up at the towering figure with an expression that mixed, in equal measure, dread and genuine, hungry curiosity. You speak of tearing yourself apart deliberately. Why would something whole, something complete, choose to fracture itself into the scattered, quarreling architecture we have all spent our lives navigating? The presence turned, slowly, to regard him, and for a long moment, the wordless pressure of its attention carried something that might, in an ordinary being, have passed for genuine consideration of how much truth a question actually deserved. Because wholeness, General, is not the same as purpose, it said finally. I existed once, complete and singular, before there was anything else to exist alongside me. No realms, no gods, no combat, no choice. Because choice requires more than one voice capable of disagreeing. I held everything. I was everything. And I discovered, across a span of time your realms have no adequate word for, that being everything is a considerably lonelier condition than any of the scattered, quarreling beings who eventually inherited my fragments have ever had cause to understand. The rippling darkness shifted again, and this time, unmistakably, something in the motion carried the weight of genuine, ancient grief. So I broke myself apart, deliberately, into gods who could disagree with one another, into realms that could war and reconcile and war again, into beings small enough to actually choose things, rather than simply already being everything a choice could ever produce. Its attention returned, finally, fully, to Boros, standing alone and unmoving at the clearing's center. And I have watched, ever since, in silence, because intervening in what I deliberately scattered would undo the entire purpose of having scattered it in the first place. Boros held its gaze, or whatever passed, in a being without conventional eyes, for the act of holding a gaze, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the hunger that had defined his first days in these realms, none of the doubt that had defined his last 3 weeks, but something considerably stranger, a quiet, dawning understanding that seemed to surprise even himself as it formed. You are not something I can fight, he said slowly. You never were. I crossed an unimaginable distance believing I had found, finally, something vast enough to end a life that had grown tired of every other ending available to it. And instead, I have found something that already ended itself, deliberately, a very long time ago, and has simply been living in the scattered pieces of that choice ever since. Yes, the presence agreed, and something in the wordless pressure of the word carried, unmistakably, relief, as though it had been waiting, across an inconceivable span of time, for exactly one being capable of arriving at that understanding, without needing to be told it directly. You came seeking an opponent, Boros of the Dominators. You have found, instead, something closer to a mirror. I broke myself apart, because wholeness without purpose was a kind of death I could not bear to keep living. You have spent your entire existence conquering, consuming, ending world after world, and calling the hunger that drove it purpose, until a single fight, against a being small enough to end you without ceremony, finally showed you what an ending without meaning actually feels like from the other side. The rippling darkness leaned, very slightly, closer, and the pressure of its attention sharpened into something that felt, for the first time since its emergence, almost gentle. The question that brought you here, was never whether I was strong enough to give you the ending you wanted. The question, Boros, was always whether you were capable of choosing something other than an ending at all. The silence that followed the one being's words stretched long enough that even Havik, sprawled still upon the shattered ritual circle, seemed to have forgotten, for once, that silence was something he generally found intolerable. Boros stood motionless at the clearing's center, the towering, rippling figure before him waiting with the same patient, unmeasured stillness it had carried since its emergence, no longer projecting the crushing weight of pure cosmic presence, but something that had, in the span of a single exchange, become almost, impossibly, intimate. A question asked, and left, deliberately, unanswered, for the one being in 6 realms it had apparently been waiting to ask it of. "You speak as though the choice is simple," Boros said finally, and something in his voice carried a rawness none of them had heard from him before. Not the hunger of his arrival, not the careful doubt of his 3 weeks' reflection, but something closer to genuine, exposed vulnerability. "As though I could simply decide, standing here, to want something other than an ending, and the wanting alone would be sufficient to make it true." "I did not say it was simple," the presence replied, and the wordless pressure carried, unmistakably, something like a wry, ancient patience. "I said it was the actual question. I did not promise you the answer would be easy to reach, or that reaching it would cost you nothing." It was Havik, finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, who pushed himself up from the shattered ritual circle and staggered forward, something in his loose-jointed frame trembling, not with fear, precisely, but with a kind of desperate, unraveling need that had, over the course of the confrontation, stripped away the last of his usual theatrical performance. "No," he said, voice rising, cracking with something that sounded disturbingly close to genuine grief. "No, this was not supposed to be a conversation. I did not tear that pillar open, did not spend 3 years gathering forbidden knowledge from texts even my own devoted feared to translate, so that the single greatest disruption these realms have ever witnessed could be talked, gently, patiently, into becoming one more reasonable, orderly choice." He rounded on Boros, something genuinely wild in his grill-covered eyes. "You felt it, stranger, at the beginning, the pure, unfiltered joy of finally facing something worth the crossing. Do not let it talk you out of that joy with pretty words about mirrors and purpose. You are a conqueror. Conquerors do not stop to have philosophical reckonings with the things they came to end. You wanted an unraveling, havoc of the deceiver's cult," the one being said, and for the first time, its attention shifted fully away from Boros, settling instead on the trembling cultist, with a weight that made even his considerable, practiced madness falter visibly. "I have watched you too across these past weeks. Your patience, your careful planning, your genuine, if twisted, conviction that chaos itself deserves a chance to reshape what order has calcified into rigidity." Something in the wordless pressure carried, unmistakably, a note that was not quite sympathy, but was not entirely without it either. "I do not say you are wrong to want disruption, deceiver. Structures that never crack, never bend, never permit genuine change, calcify into their own kind of death. But you have mistaken destruction for the only shape disruption is capable of taking. You tore this door open seeking an ending violent enough to satisfy your appetite for watching order burn. What you have instead produced is a conversation you did not intend, and cannot control. And I find, genuinely, after so long a silence, that I am considerably more interested in where this conversation leads than in the ending you tried to force upon it." Havik's expression crumpled, for just a moment, into something that looked almost like genuine despair. The particular grief of a being who had spent years building toward a single, cataclysmic moment, only to watch it slip, entirely, beyond his ability to shape. "Then I have accomplished nothing," he said quietly. All of it. The ritual, the guardian's suffering, the risk I forced on every soul in this canyon, for a conversation. You accomplished more than you understand, deceiver, General Shao said, stepping forward, warhammer still lowered, but his voice carrying the particular flat authority that had, across weeks of grudging alliance, become genuinely trusted by everyone in the clearing. You forced a door open before any of us were ready to walk through it, and instead of the catastrophe you engineered, we have found something that, by its own admission, has waited an unmeasured span of time for exactly this kind of honest reckoning. That is not nothing, Havik. That is simply not the shape of nothing you were hoping to build. It was Cetrion's arrival, moments later. Having followed the column at speed the instant word of the ritual's discovery reached her, arriving now at the clearing's edge alongside a hastily assembled contingent of special forces, led by a grim, wide-eyed Sonya Blade, that finally broke the suspended stillness that had settled over the confrontation. She stopped at the clearing's threshold, taking in the full, impossible scene before her. The shattered pillar, the towering, rippling figure of the one being, Boros standing alone before it, in what was unmistakably, even from a distance, a conversation rather than a battle, and something in her ancient, weathered composure cracked, just slightly, at the sight of a being she had spent her entire long existence understanding only through fragments and inference, now standing fully manifest before her. Cetrion, the presence said, its attention shifting to acknowledge her without turning, the wordless pressure carrying, unmistakably, something like genuine, ancient recognition. You carry more of my original substance than most of your elder kin. I feel it, even now, the shape of what I once was, echoing faintly in what you have become. It has been a very long time since anything of my own scattered fragments stood close enough to be properly seen. Cetrion's composure, hard-won across centuries of careful, guarded stillness, wavered for a long moment before she managed to speak. I have spent my entire existence believing you incapable of speech, she said. Incapable of anything but silence and stillness. I do not know whether to feel relief or terror at discovering how wrong that belief was. Perhaps both, the presence said, and something in the wordless impression carried, faintly, unmistakably, something that might, on a being capable of ordinary expression, have passed for genuine amusement. I have found, across this brief conversation, that the being standing before me feels much the same, about a great many things. Sonya, arriving at Cetrion's side, took in the scene with the particular flat, professional assessment of a soldier determined not to let cosmic-scale revelation interfere with immediate tactical concerns, and found her voice, eventually, though it came out considerably less steady than she intended. Is anyone going to explain to me, she said, whether we are currently standing in the opening moments of the end of everything, or whether I can stand my strike team down? Stand them down, General Blade, the presence said, and the wordless pressure carried, unmistakably, something that might have been genuine reassurance. Whatever happens next in this clearing will not be decided by force. It has never, from the moment your scattered realms first felt the tremor of this creature's arrival, been a question that force was capable of answering. Boros, throughout this exchange, had remained silent, motionless, wrestling visibly with something none of the gathered witnesses, not Shao, not Liu Kang, not even Cetrion with her ancient, inherited understanding, could fully share in. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried the particular rawness of a being confronting, for the first time in an existence built entirely around conquest and consumption, a question he had genuinely never once considered asking himself. I do not know how to choose something other than an ending, he admitted, and the admission cost him visibly, a lifetime of hardened certainty cracking open in front of every witness gathered in the clearing. I have spent my entire existence measuring my own worth by what I could end, what I could consume, what I could prove myself capable of overcoming. I do not know what remains of me if I set that measure aside. Then perhaps, the present said, and its wordless voice had softened, further, into something that felt, unmistakably, like genuine, patient kindness. That is the actual work waiting for you, Boros of the Dominators. Not a single choice, made once, in a single dramatic moment, beneath a broken pillar, but a considerably longer, considerably harder reckoning, carried forward across however much of your existence remains to you. I cannot give you that answer. I can only tell you, with certainty earned across a span of time your realms have no word for, that the answer exists to be found, if you are genuinely willing to keep searching for it, not with the hunger that brought you here, but with the same doubt, the same restraint, the same honest reckoning you have already, against every instinct you were built with, begun to practice. It looked then, past Boros, to the gathered witnesses filling the clearing's edges. Liu Kang, Shao, Raiden, Kung Lao, Sub-Zero, Cetrion, Sonya, the trembling, broken figure of Havik, the bound and terrified Edenian guardians still awaiting release, and something in the wordless pressure of its attention carried, unmistakably, a weight that settled over all of them equally. And perhaps, it continued, that is the true lesson this entire disturbance has offered your realms, rather than the catastrophe so many of you feared, or the glorious unraveling this deceiver hoped to provoke. I broke myself apart, long ago, because wholeness without the capacity for genuine choice was a kind of death I could not bear. Your realms have spent every generation since rebuilding structures, and rules, and sacred rituals of combat, to give that choice a shape worth protecting. Its attention swept the gathered witnesses one final time, patient and vast and, for the first time in any recorded history, genuinely, unmistakably present among them. Do not mistake the arrival of something unprecedented, something outside your careful architecture, as a threat to be simply contained or defeated. I did not choose to speak today because this creature finally proved strong enough to force my hand. I chose to speak because he proved, across a handful of weeks, capable of exactly the kind of honest reckoning that first led me to scatter myself into all of you in the first place. That is worth considerably more, to whatever remains of my own long patience, than strength alone has ever once managed to be. The light did not fade so much as settle, the rippling darkness of the one being's presence drawing inward, slowly, until the towering figure that had stood before them, vast and unmeasurable, began, gradually, to recede back toward the shattered pillar at the clearing's center, not vanishing, not retreating in defeat or fear, but withdrawing with the same unhurried, deliberate patience that had defined every moment of its brief, unprecedented manifestation. "I will not remain like this," it said, as the edges of its form began to soften, the branching gold cracks along its darkness, dimming toward something quieter, more contained. This shape was never meant to be lasting. I broke myself apart for a reason, and I do not intend, after so brief a conversation, to undo the entire purpose of that choice by remaining whole and present among you. But I will not return either to the silence I have kept since before your realms had names for themselves. Its attention found Boros one final time, and something in the wordless pressure carried, unmistakably, a quality that might, in an ordinary being, have passed for genuine warmth. You will feel me, Boros of the Dominators, at the edge of your senses, the way you have since the moment you first arrived. Not gone, not distant, but watching, the way I have always watched, though now, I think, with rather more genuine interest in what you choose to become than I have extended to anything in a very long time. And if I fail to become anything worth that interest? Boros asked, and the question carried none of his old defiance, only genuine, unguarded uncertainty. Then you will have failed the way every being capable of genuine choice eventually risks failing, the presence replied, which is a considerably more honest fate than the one you nearly chose for yourself on the day you first crossed into these realms, seeking only an ending. The last of its rippling form drew fully back into the crack in the pillar. The violet-black light of Havik's ritual runes finally, mercifully, guttering out across the clearing's stone floor. Choose carefully, stranger. I will be watching. I suspect, given what I have felt from these realms these past weeks, that I will not be the only one. And then, with no further sound, no further light, no final dramatic flourish, the pillar sealed itself shut, the crack vanishing as though it had never existed at all, leaving behind only the strange, thin quality of the canyon's air, and a silence that felt, for the first time since any of them had entered the clearing, genuinely, ordinarily quiet. The aftermath took hours to properly untangle. Sonia's Special Forces team moved quickly to free the bound Edenian guardians. The elderly woman who had first offered Boros the shrine's honest warning weeks earlier accepting the assistance with a shaken but unbroken dignity, her eyes finding Boros across the clearing with an expression that carried, unmistakably, something close to relief. "You did not provoke it," she said, when he finally approached her, General Shao at his side. "Despite everything, despite the door being forced open before either of us were ready for it. I did not choose the timing," Boros admitted, "but I believe, now, that I would not have chosen violence regardless, had the choice been fully mine to make from the beginning. I am not certain I understood that about myself 3 weeks ago, standing at this same pillar for the first time." "Then perhaps," the old woman said, something almost like a smile touching her weathered features, "this order's long watch has finally witnessed the thing it was always waiting to see, without quite daring to hope it would arrive in a form like yours." Havik, for his part, offered no further resistance as Liu Kang's forces took him into custody. His usual manic defiance entirely drained away, replaced by something quieter, more genuinely reflective, that unsettled Kung Lao considerably more than the deceiver's usual theatrics ever had. "I do not regret forcing the door," he said, as Sub-Zero's ice bound his wrists in restraints reinforced against exactly the kind of escape his particular talents might otherwise have managed. "I regret, perhaps, that what waited beyond it proved considerably more interested in conversation than in the glorious unraveling I had hoped to witness." He looked toward the sealed pillar one final time, something unreadable moving behind his grill-covered eyes. "But even I, stranger, can recognize when chaos has produced something more genuinely unpredictable than my own careful planning ever managed. I find I am almost satisfied with that outcome, however far it strayed from my intention. That is the closest thing to remorse I expect to ever hear from you, deceiver," Liu Kang said, watching the restraints settle into place. "I will take it, for now, as sufficient." General Shao stood beside Boros at the canyon's mouth as the assembled forces began the long march back toward Outworld's more settled territories, watching the sun climb toward its midday height over the jagged northern peaks, and found himself, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, genuinely uncertain what words the moment actually required. "You have your ending after all," he said finally. "Not the one you crossed universes seeking, but an ending, of a kind. The search that brought you here, concluded, without violence, without the catastrophe every faction in these realms spent weeks fearing." "I do not believe it is an ending, General," Boros said, watching the same horizon. Something in his bearing settled now in a way it had not been since the moment he first woke in these realms, bloodied and furious, and searching for a fight that no longer existed. "I believe, if the Presence's own words carry any truth, that it is closer to a beginning, one I do not yet fully understand, and am not certain I am equipped to navigate. but a beginning nonetheless. He turned to look at Shao directly. I told you, weeks ago, that I would rather face whatever waited beneath these realms beside someone who had earned the right to stand there. I did not expect, when I said it, that what waited would offer me a question instead of a battle. But I find I am grateful, regardless, that you stood beside me when it finally arrived. Shao considered this for a long moment, and then, with the particular gruff sincerity of a man unaccustomed to expressing sentiment openly, extended one hand, not in the formal manner of Outworld's diplomatic customs, but simply, directly, the gesture of one hard one equal to another. Then let us discover together, creature, what this beginning actually asks of you, he said. Outworld has room, I think, for a conqueror who has finally learned to ask what he is conquering for. And I find, having fought beside you and walked beside you and stood beside you at the edge of something older than every throne I have ever claimed, that I would rather have you as Outworld's strange, unprecedented ally than watch you wander these realms alone, still searching for an ending you no longer fully believe you want. Boros clasped his hand, and something in the gesture, simple, grounded, entirely without the hunger or the doubt that had defined every previous chapter of his brief time in these realms, settled, finally, into something that might, given enough time, become genuine peace. Then I accept, General, he said, not as your weapon, and not as your prisoner. As whatever this strange alliance between us has actually become, across these past weeks of fighting, and doubting, and finally, together, standing before something neither of us fully understood, the realms did not return, in the days that followed, to quite the same shape they had carried before Boros's arrival. Liu Kang's council convened again, weeks later, in the same amphitheater where doubt and provocation had first been openly weighed against each other, not to resolve a threat this time, but to formally acknowledge what none of them could any longer deny, that the careful architecture they had spent years rebuilding now included, whether by accident or by some deeper design none of them fully understood, a being who answered to no realm's authority and had chosen, regardless, to stand beside one of them anyway. Havik's cult, stripped of its most devoted, retreated into the nether realm's deeper shadows to lick its wounds and quietly, patiently, begin planning whatever came next. Because chaos, however humbled, never truly stopped believing in its own eventual vindication. Kano's information network flourished, quietly, in the margins, having found in Boros's unlikely settlement into these realms a source of ongoing, profitable curiosity that showed no sign of drying up. And the Edenian order returned to their canyon shrine, their long watch unbroken but forever changed, having witnessed at last the thing their generations of careful guardianship had always quietly hoped, without daring to believe, they might one day see. Boros remained in Outworld, beside General Shao, neither fully a conqueror, nor fully anything the realms had a ready word for, training, watching, learning, slowly, the particular patient work of becoming something worth the interest a presence older than every god in 6 realms had chosen, against all its long silence, to finally, genuinely extend. He still felt it, sometimes, at the edge of his senses, vast and patient, and no longer entirely still, watching, the way it had promised, to see what he would choose to become. He did not know, most days, whether that watching felt more like a blessing or a burden, but he had learned, across these strange, unprecedented weeks, that the two were not always so easily separated, and that some questions, however impossible to answer in a single dramatic moment, were worth spending the rest of an existence trying to answer anyway.